The protagonist of our tale yearned for a blissful existence, but he perished before attaining it. Luckily, he was reborn into the form of a youthful man from an affluent household, precisely as he had envisioned. Nevertheless, he promptly discerned that he now resided in the very realm he once battled against. Furthermore, the adolescent whose physique he now occupied, a notorious rapscallion, was fated to meet his demise within 2 years. Can our protagonist avert his destiny and ultimately experience the life he perpetually desired? That's what we'll discover in this chronicle. The saga commences with the apocalypse. The champions who exerted their utmost to prevent it were despondent that they were unsuccessful. The commander of the heroes, Evan, was disenchanted with himself for his inadequacy. He declared that the true hero should have been Chris, not himself. The individual he referenced was seated behind him. A female sorceress disagreed with Evan's assertion. She informed him that they had still given their all, and she appended that, if the prodigious Chris had acquired swordsmanship proficiency sooner, he undoubtedly would have eclipsed the 9th star, and even ascended to a 10-star hero. Had that transpired, the lady surmised, that Evan and Chris would have collaborated to halt the apocalypse. Chris, our central figure, is a magnificent supporting character. This moniker was bestowed upon him for the innumerable accomplishments he achieved, owing to his extraordinary aptitude, which enabled him to conquer any skill instantaneously. The odyssey of the magnificent supporting character commenced on the day a 20-year-old, who had absconded from a deplorable noble estate, fantasized about prosperity in the shadowy alleyways. The incursion of the blood sovereign of the esoteric realm, widely recognized as the Epic of Devastation, had initiated. Upon its commencement, Chris observed the recruitment notices on the barriers, summoning individuals to unite with the heroes as their comrades. At that juncture, Chris perceived it as a golden opportunity. He was convinced that if he enlisted, he would accomplish remarkable exploits, and upon the war's conclusion, he would revel in boundless opulence and renown. However, they were vanquished. The legions of light ultimately succumbed to the blood sovereign. Chris remained taciturn while listening to Evan declare that if it were feasible, he would reverse time and appoint Chris as the hero. They were oblivious to Chris's lack of desire to relive this torment. Even if he could rewind time, a single lifetime of anguish was ample for him. Moreover, discussing it now was futile, as he anticipated the world's imminent destruction. He expected this to be the terminus, certain that there was no possibility of a subsequent opportunity. But if granted a chance, he aspired to be born as an affluent nobleman's offspring. Still, he deemed it an improbable occurrence. As he shut his eyes, everything astonishingly transformed. Chris had regressed, but into another's body, the body of a young lord of the esoteric realm. He now resided in the House of Shadow Arcana, one of the 12 families sustaining the esoteric realm. As its menacing name implied, upon verification, Chris ascertained that he had regressed 15 years into the past. In other words, he had reverted to an era 5 years preceding the commencement of the Epic of Devastation. He presumed he had encountered virtually everything in his prior life, but he never anticipated witnessing monstrous creatures cultivating a garden. Furthermore, he knew precisely whose body he now inhabited. It was Christian Van Baron-Kazar. Previously, he had learned about this individual from his comrades, and observing the middle name Van, he instantly deduced that Christian originated from a cadet lineage of the Magus ancestry. The Kazar Count family was a cadet branch of the Baron Count family, a segment of the House of Shadow Arcana. Even as a cadet branch, they were still formally affiliated with the House of Shadow Arcana, and moreover, they possessed immense wealth. No one within the esoteric realm was ignorant of the Kazar family. They had 2 sons eligible for inheritance, and the elder Christian was the most depraved of all scoundrels. Christian, a complete reprobate, instigated so many predicaments that even the Kazar family ultimately relinquished hope for him. Chris once inquired of his companion why Christian eventually reformed, and his companion retorted that it was due to Christian being assassinated by his own kinsman. Recalling this caused Chris to perspire in trepidation that it might also be his destiny. He shattered the window in vexation, lamenting internally that he merely desired to be an ordinary affluent youth. If he had to regress, why did it have to be into this specific family? Why did he have to become Christian Van? Why the physical form of a condemned rogue destined for demise? He was distraught, contemplating a method to evade execution. It had been 72 hours since he regained consciousness within another's physique. bearing a name unsettlingly akin to his own. And Christian Van was fated to perish in a mere 2 years. The circumstance that the Khazar Count clan, which esteemed honor, personally terminated him, was probably due to his being an incorrigible villain. Now Chris deduced that if he remained silent, he might avert his death. Having become the offspring of an affluent household, he reasoned he should simply proceed cautiously and relish opulence and prestige, like hell he would. He recalled Ragnarok, the apocalypse, the impetus for the Blood Monarch's warmongering. His objective was to utilize humanity as a sacrifice to bring about Ragnarok. By the time the heroes and Chris grasped this truth, it was already far too late. The forces of good and the Magic Empire had both met their demise. To endure, Chris knew he had to forestall the annihilation. The Blood Monarch, the architect of the conflict, presented a significant obstacle, but an even greater predicament was the multitude of demons from the Magic Empire who served him. To halt this, Chris determined he must eclipse the Blood Monarch, and there existed only a single path. He had to become the demon sovereign and ascend to the zenith of the Magic Empire. The time allotted to him until the epoch of destruction commenced was 5 years. He contemplated whether to attempt it, recognizing that inaction would inevitably result in death. Moreover, should he triumph, he believed the estate and all within the Magic Empire would be his. Upon solidifying his resolve, he promptly sought out his father. His father was enraged, reminding him of his confinement to his quarters for reflection. "How dare you brazenly present yourself? So soon after your last transgression? If you behave recklessly again, I'll sever your head, Count," Khazar furiously declared. Chris gazed at him, sensing his father's formidable presence. "I've come to atone for my past misdeeds, father," he stated. To execute his scheme, he needed to first relinquish his reputation as a scoundrel. He expressed genuine remorse to his father and vowed to prevent any recurrence. "After all your despicable actions until recently, you expect me to accept that? Are you mocking me now?" Count Khazar retorted, leading Chris to ponder. What sort of havoc Christian had wreaked just prior to the recent incident? It was simply overwhelming. Forfeiting your trust was entirely my fault. But didn't I inform you 3 days ago that I'd suffered partial memory loss? As I introspected to recover them, I agonizingly recognized the depravity of my past life, he declared. Count Khazar responded that he had heard this supposed remorse innumerable times. Since his father wouldn't believe mere words, Chris asserted that expressions of regret were futile. Hence, he was prepared to demonstrate his sincerity through deeds. He consented to be sent to the penitentiary ward and pledged to spend a month there in contemplation. To showcase his genuineness, the penitentiary ward was a facility where high-ranking demons were incarcerated for their offenses, an area devoid of not only light, but all sensory input. A few days within could shatter an individual. However, Chris genuinely believed it was the ideal location for him, requiring solitude away from prying eyes. After expressing his desire for confinement in the penitentiary ward, his father scoffed, convinced he wouldn't endure half a day. "Indeed, I acknowledge its severity, but it necessitates harshness." "Wouldn't father's trust in me increase if I succeeded?" Chris countered. Still, Count Khazar remained incredulous. Christian had uttered such sentiments countless times, and invariably disappointed him. Fortunately, he chose to grant his son a final opportunity. But if no change manifested within a month, he would disown him. Chris understood that without familial protection, numerous individuals would eagerly seek his demise. He acknowledged his understanding and requested a single favor upon proving his transformation. His father was irritated by his audacity, yet consented, proclaiming he would grant any request if he genuinely reformed. Count Khazar departed, leaving Chris kneeling. Meanwhile, in his chambers, Chris fixated on an object in his hand when Cox, the Khazar household steward, entered and announced the penitentiary ward's readiness. "Understood," he responded. Chris promptly proceeded to the penitentiary ward, accompanied by Cox. En route, Chris overheard the servants' whispers about him. For willingly entering the penal chamber, he learned that he had previously offended the daughter of the Venom Syndicate, a transgression that compelled the Earl to issue a personal apology. Chris also discovered that the Venom Syndicate and the Khazar lineage were already adversaries, and Christian had utterly demolished the Earl's standing. With his demeanor, he disregarded the attendants, even as he perceived them, uttering that he wouldn't endure within the penal chamber. He simply grinned as he proceeded. A lad concealed himself behind a column, folding his arms and anticipating Chris, desiring to witness if he would genuinely enter the penal chamber. After a brief period, Chris and Cox reached the threshold. Chris gazed at the portal momentarily and observed the Dark Paladin serving as a jailer, a truly conventional Arcane Kingdom tactic. Just as he was on the verge of entering, he detected someone addressing him as brother. He rotated his head and spotted the youth from the column, solely from his countenance. Chris immediately recognized this was Christian's younger sibling, a complete paragon, Tran Van Baron Kazar. To his astonishment, Tran aimed a thin sword at his throat with remarkable swiftness. Chris was startled and fixated on his brother. Inwardly, he experienced a tinge of trepidation, but he collected himself and maintained his composure. "What do you desire? Doesn't appear you're here to bid me farewell," he uttered. "You comprehend you're the shame of this family, correct? I'm unaware of what sort of plot you're concocting presently. But should you besmirch our family's honor once more, I shall eliminate you personally. Understood?" "That's a caution," Tran declared resolutely. Due to Tran's audacity, Chris deduced that Christian Van might have perished by his hand. Chris had actually encountered Tran during the period of devastation. He was a rather infamous fiend for his hexing magic. Observing him now, Tran genuinely appeared somewhat endearing as a youngster, and it was evident he had diligently practiced. Nevertheless, to one who had clawed through the squalor of the period of devastation, Chris could merely remark, "This aptitude is merely a child's play." He instructed Tran to withdraw. Tran was stunned by his retort. "I perceived you distinctly. Now depart," Chris appended. The youth cautioned him again, but he disregarded it and progressed into the penal chamber without glancing back. Tran felt affronted, muttering externally, but he was powerless. Now that Chris had already ventured inside, Chris traversed the shadowy corridors of the penal chamber. He surveyed his surroundings but couldn't detect or perceive anything. At the very least, there remained a faint sensation in his fingertips, likely residual, just sufficient for him to rummage through the provisions they had furnished him. Otherwise, he would perish from starvation. He concluded that an ordinary individual would rapidly descend into madness here, but that wasn't his predicament. He had endured far worse during his time as a relic seeker. Having his senses severed was precisely his desire. It would enable him to gaze deep within himself, the sole method he could ever mend this shattered physique. Undoubtedly, it would necessitate time and a considerable amount of fortune, but the medical expertise he had acquired through grueling ordeals, back when they hailed him as the celestial healer, coupled with the corporeal alteration methods he gleaned from the carnival, constituted his skeletal reconstruction technique. Finally, since he possessed a magical core imbued with diverse forms of magical energy, he might just accomplish this. Frankly, he never envisioned acquiring a magical core. They were excessively costly. However, belonging to an affluent, privileged family did possess advantages. After all, even a pampered child's request was granted instantaneously, recalling all the hardships he and Evan endured in his previous existence. To locate magical energy, he commenced with the ivory magical core, which served to cleanse poisons and impurities. It was a mundane phase, but exceptionally crucial. He had to meticulously purify each tainted segment of his anatomy, utilizing ivory magical energy. A single misstep could result in him becoming grotesquely deformed. As he initiated the procedure, a smile materialized on his visage. He was certain this would be effortless for him. The following day, Earl Khazar summoned Cox to his study and inquired about his offspring. Despite Chris willingly proceeding to the penal chamber, Earl Khazar remained apprehensive that his offspring might be excessively shattered to even summon assistance. He lamented dispatching him there. Back when Christian was still a youth, Earl Khazar had regarded him as a promising prodigy. Therefore, he couldn't comprehend why his offspring had abruptly crumbled. A portion of him surmised that his offspring's extraordinary aptitude had rendered him haughty. Regardless of the rationale, if his offspring was destined to endure such misery, Count Khazar pondered. If incompetence would have been preferable, or even demise. He recalled Chris's earnest vow to validate himself through deeds, but Count Khazar oscillated his head, resistant to accepting it. Given Christian's numerous past betrayals, he resisted anticipating any alteration this time. He inquired of Cox about any irregularities upon his son's entry into the disciplinary chamber. Cox, flustered by the inquiry, stammered, inciting Count Khazar to interrupt and mandate a comprehensive account. Omitting nothing, Count Khazar tightened his fists. Upon learning his son had procured magical stones within the disciplinary chamber, including a dreamstone known to evoke illusions. Uncertain of potential repercussions, Cox proposed immediate access to the disciplinary chamber, But Count Khazar declined, and decreed his son should perish within. 1 month later, Chris's appointed release arrived, and Count Khazar attended personally, bracing for the direst outcome. Unexpectedly, Chris unsealed the door, astonishing the Count. "You've come, father? I've awaited you," Chris uttered, advancing towards his father, presuming his survival was a shock. Still breathing, he halted before his father, invoking his pledge of emerging a reformed man. The Count was rendered speechless. Chris smiled, discerning a familiar paternal expression from his youth. "So you persevered, I observe," Count Khazar remarked, which Chris interpreted as praise. Count Khazar folded his arms, declaring continued distrust. Chris countered that increased effort was required. He deduced that Count Khazar believed he barely survived, which was utterly false. If anything, tedium was non-existent. Initially, he honed his physique for sword mastery, utilizing the white magic stone. Every cell felt rejuvenated. The Dream Stone, despite its peril, proved a brilliant maneuver. Cox facilitated acquiring the stones, despite reprimanding him for it, as the Dream Stone is categorized as an addictive magical stone. However, Chris was certain the risk was justified. The illusions significantly expedited his metamorphosis, even enabling the creation of 2 cores. Consequently, a Tier 1 light magic core manifested. He could confidently proclaim his genius. Naturally, he masked the light core with darkness for concealment. Demonic discovery would undoubtedly incite chaos. Concluding matters in the disciplinary chamber would have been ideal, but someone seemingly intended the stone to shatter him through hallucinations. Instead, Chris leveraged it for advancement. Currently, Chris reiterated his petition. Count Khazar granted him leave to speak. He requested access to the training arena of the Black Swamp Knights. However, Count Khazar was irked, reminding him the training arena wasn't readily accessible to a reprobate. Like himself, this arena belonged to a knightly order, upholding the dark curse reserved for elite knights to exhibit their prowess. "I merely request temporary use of the grounds," observing the intrepid. "Black Swamp Knights would be motivational. I don't aspire to join the order," Chris clarified. His father paused, then retorted, "Very well, but should you disgrace yourself before the Black Swamp Knights, expect repercussions." As the Count prepared to depart, Chris announced a further request. The following day, Chris proceeded directly to the Black Swamp Knights training grounds. The Order's members were astonished by his presence. He remained focused despite surrounding murmurs, being labeled the imbecilic young master, and questioned about his presence. Though irritated, he maintained composure, recalling that within the Mage Empire, power superseded status. In reality, Chris harbored an ulterior motive for visiting the Black Swamp Knights. His father had instructed him to secure a letter of recommendation from Vice Commander Mellon in exchange for access to the archives. This constituted his second paternal request. The archives housed House Khazar's dark magic collection, essential for Chris's mastery of dark magic. He was obligated to enter regardless. His father had granted his petition, but also inquired why he was imposing stipulations on his admittance. Considering his status as a family member, Count Khazar subsequently reminded him of his past attempt to peddle potent magic texts on the illicit market for a paltry sum. Chris was utterly dismayed by this disclosure. Christian Van Truly had been a notorious rogue, resolute in his desire to swiftly secure the deputy commander's endorsement. He discovered his path obstructed by Trin and fellow knights. "This is no place for scum like you to tread," Trin declared, visibly irked by his brother's troublesome presence. Chris was on the verge of departing when a realization struck him, prompting a smile. This was precisely the opportunity he required. "This is your ultimate admonition. Depart now lest you forfeit the life you precariously cling to," Trent warned from the disciplinary chamber, advancing towards him. Chris then inquired of his younger sibling if he would assume accountability for his pronouncements. With unwavering assurance, Trin informed his brother that their father had personally sanctioned his entry into the training grounds. Upon hearing this, Trin was stunned into silence. Just then, someone intervened. "I honor the Count's decree, but it offers little solace. Young Master Christian." Chris turned his head, instantly recognizing the speaker. Vice Captain Mellon, possessing at least 4-star magical prowess. Chris sensed Mellon's attempts to intimidate him from the outset, but he was accustomed to such intimidations. He courteously greeted the captain, who was astonished by his resistance to her magical aura. Chris then declared that he had no alternative but to demonstrate his entitlement to utilize the training area. "How about I engage in a duel with one of the senior officers present and emerge triumphant?" he suggested. The officers assumed he jested, but he assured them of his sincerity. He then appended a request to restrict the utilization of magical power, citing his imperfect physical condition as a consequence of his prior dissolute lifestyle. Therefore, an unarmed combat would be more suitable. Melon contemplated the predicament and mused internally that she couldn't permit harm to befall the heir, as it would prove to be a considerable problem. Do you believe you possess a fighting chance simply because it's an unarmed confrontation? Young master? She questioned, arms folded. Chris smirked and retorted, We won't know until we attempt it. Who would present a worthy adversary? He snapped his fingers and proclaimed Trin as his chosen opponent. Trin, feeling deeply offended, remained silent. Simultaneously, Melon, fueled by anger, objected and instructed Chris to select a more fitting contender, given Trin's 2 ND star level. The 2nd star level is not an attainment a typical 13-year-old can achieve without innate aptitude. Even individuals in their 20s struggle to enter that domain. However, Chris remained confident that he was no ordinary wastrel. Chris shook his head in dissent. If I am to validate my qualifications, I should confront someone superior to myself. Trin remains the optimal choice. He solicited Trin's perspective and boldly questioned if he harbored any fear. Enraged, Trin accepted the challenge without a moment's pause. They then assumed their positions on the field. Encircled by onlookers, naturally the crowd unanimously championed Trin's victory. Vice Captain, how do we ascertain victory? Until one of us yields? Chris inquired. Melon felt a surge of annoyance, perceiving Chris's question as impertinent and disrespectful. That's far too tedious. Let's prolong it until one of you is rendered incapacitated, she responded. Now that events had progressed thus far, it would be advantageous for her if Trin at least managed to debilitate one of Chris's legs. After outlining the victory criteria, Chris inquired if Trin had clearly comprehended the regulations, even taunting him. With the prospect of a severe thrashing, Trin was incandescent with rage and vowed to silence Chris permanently. Chris lunged forward without pause and delivered a resounding slap to Trin's face. Trin was utterly bewildered. Chris, with a sardonic grin, remarked, What are you waiting for? The confrontation has commenced. Trin wiped the blood from his lips and ordered Chris to be silent. He launched an attack, but Chris deftly evaded it. In truth, Chris's tactics bordered on chicanery. As a mage who hadn't even attained the 1st star level, if they were to engage in magical combat, he feared he would be utterly outmatched. However, in unarmed combat, he possessed the experience of countless past battles. Armed with this knowledge, he managed to land numerous blows upon Trin. Furthermore, considering the starlight he had attained, within the disciplinary chamber, he had already attained the 3rd star rank. The surrounding sorcerers were astonished by the spectacle. Currently, Trin was hemorrhaging. His head bowed in agony, Chris still possessed the audacity to taunt him, implying he was weeping. Gasping for air, Trin inquired about the ruse Chris had employed. Merely observing Trin's countenance invigorated Chris. Ruse, there's no deception. Perhaps you're simply feeble? He retorted. Trin was consumed by fury. He insisted Chris reiterate his previous statement, but Chris prevaricated, asserting he hadn't heard him due to his diminutive stature. Trin, incapable of restraining himself, resolved to utilize magic ultimately. He lunged at Chris, pledging to eliminate him. He attempted to strike him, but Chris still evaded with a smirk. Trin made several further attempts, but the identical outcome transpired. Unexpectedly, Chris parried Trin's arm with a spell. Trin was stunned upon observing it. Chris then capitalized on the chance to deliver a powerful blow, inducing Trin to regurgitate blood and crumple to the floor. Everyone was incredulous. Some remarked that Trin had lowered his defenses, while others conjectured that he had suppressed his magical prowess to prevent grievously injuring his sibling. Melon was equally astonished. Chris then questioned her if the altercation sufficiently demonstrated his aptitude. Melon affirmed, and Chris expressed his gratitude. He was elated to have succeeded. Now his objective was to master everything: swordsmanship, magic, and all else. The following day, Chris achieved 1 star in magic. Given his unfamiliarity with mana manipulation and the lingering remnants of Christian's essence, it consumed more time than anticipated. It appeared he needed to ascend to a greater level prior to wielding the potency of light. Along with magic, clutching a bell, he rang it, and someone entered inquiring if he had summoned her. It was Marie, Christian's devoted handmaiden, a banshee. Chris discerned why Christian possessed a high-ranking malevolent spirit, like a banshee as a servant. He was certain that, considering Christian's despotism, It had rendered employing human attendants impossible. Nevertheless, Chris aspired to alter that eventually. Since Marie had appeared, he instructed her to fetch him some juice before proceeding to training. Marie inquired if he desired human blood as juice, but he responded that he preferred strawberry juice. He was irked when Marie declared that blood juice was more exceptional. An hour subsequently, Chris departed for the training grounds. Cox pursued him, protesting that it was premature for training, and fretting that Chris might be overexerting himself. Naturally, Cox was also pleased and gratified by Chris's diligence. Despite others criticizing him, he had consistently had faith in him. "Hey, I don't recall requesting your belief in me." "Who do you believe you are to determine whether or not to believe?" Chris retorted with a distinct demeanor. Cox promptly apologized, conceding that he had exceeded his authority. Cox then departed as Chris gazed at him, sensing something amiss about him. Meanwhile, upon reaching the training area, Chris observed that the mage's gazes had softened relative to the preceding day. He deposited his bag, contemplating that he should commence endearing himself to everyone. Someone was scrutinizing him and promptly raced to Melon's pavilion to apprise her that Christian Van had returned. Melon folded her arms, pondering Christian's scheme and the purpose of the duel with Trin. To her, Trin's maneuvers had been undeniably remarkable, but she had also observed how Chris capitalized on the opportune moment and banished the diabolic energy. She surmised that Chris might possess the ability to perceive the ebb and flow of combat. If that were accurate, Melon deduced that Chris possessed a talent eclipsing Ashad Duran, the rightful successor of the primary lineage. Nonetheless, she regarded Christian as a reprobate who had already forfeited his magical energy due to his dissolute lifestyle. Therefore, she deemed it impossible for Christian to bridge the disparity. Melon then resolved to exit her tent. When she detected a disturbance outside, it transpired that a minor dispute had arisen between Chris and his attendant. Everyone, including Melon, was astounded since Chris's adversary was already a one-star sorcerer. Someone concluded that Chris might have attained 1 star as well. I anticipated witnessing the exceptional prowess of the Black Swamp Knights. Apparently they are not as formidable as reputed. Is no one else willing to confront me? Surely you are not Craven Knights, are you? Chris inquired, which provoked most of the mages. Someone subsequently stepped forward to engage him. He presented himself as Thorn. Chris was pleased that someone had risen to the occasion and promptly dared Thorn to attack him. Thorn lunged forward, brandishing his weapon. Simultaneously, Chris was pondering that he had never anticipated. The knights would readily impart their clandestine techniques to a rogue like himself. Since that was the circumstance, he had no alternative but to pilfer them in this manner. He was relishing the battle against Thorn, scrutinizing the handle angles, the graceful footwork, and the mudsword technique he'd only heard legends of. He resolved to attempt it himself, questioning if it would be effective. And indeed, it functioned. He triumphantly struck Thorn with the maneuver. Melon was stunned. Chris then offered a faint smirk, basking in his triumph. Thorn lost consciousness after enduring a severe beating from Chris, who then perched above him, eavesdropping on the chatter amongst the other members of the order. How underwhelming. I must have anticipated too much from the knights. If your competencies are this deficient, I presume the second-in-command carries some accountability as well, Chris declared. Young master, I comprehend your enthusiasm for an unanticipated victory, but don't you believe you're becoming a bit overconfident? Milan stated. Chris then rose and challenged Milan to exhibit her capabilities, requesting her to demonstrate the true prowess of the Black Swamp Knights. Milan drew a blade from the knight behind her and slammed it into the earth with such power that it fractured. Scoundrel, a single second is ample for someone like you, she uttered. Will you truly exert your full strength against someone like me? Magic usage restricted to first tier. Dark magic forbidden, how about that? Chris proposed. Of course, utilizing wooden swords. Milan grinned and responded. First tier, with merely half of that, I'll shatter both your legs. She aimed the wooden sword at Chris, who then declared, I'm wagering my legs. So what will you stake, Vice Captain? Milan charged towards him, retorting that anything sufficed for her, since she was convinced. Chris wouldn't be departing this training area. After she finished teaching him a lesson, Chris parried her assault, trembling, but succeeding in repelling her weapon and deflecting more of her blows. Everyone was astonished to observe Chris enduring for so long against their vice captain, and someone remarked that it might be because Milan wasn't employing her primary armament, the great sword. It became apparent that Melon's attacks weren't connecting, which irritated her. She was perplexed since Chris was supposedly too feeble to be a contender. She recollected that this scenario was akin to his fights with Trin and Thorn. Things aren't proceeding quite as you envisioned. Are they? Chris inquired. Milan commanded him to be silent, clutching her sword firmly while conjuring her dark magic. She lifted her sword and unleashed a potent incantation, striking the ground. Observing the sheer force of the blow, Chris was awed but remained vigilant. He instantly leapt towards Milan and headbutted her in the face. Milan cupped her bleeding nose with her hand, and Chris was gratified that his prediction had proven accurate. Milan was a magic swordsman, and since dark magic was prescribed, the instant her defenses faltered, Chris deduced that she wouldn't be capable of shielding the vulnerability with martial techniques alone. If Milan had been a demon genuinely adept at swordsmanship, Chris concluded that this tactic might have been ineffective. Melon noticed the blood on her hand and abruptly erupted in laughter. A headbutt, I never even contemplated that. I underestimated you significantly. Young master, henceforth. I'll concentrate properly. Chris then gestured to his neck and informed her that he believed the match was already concluded, because when he headbutted her previously, he had grazed her with his fingernails, and if his nails had been laced with venom, she would have already perished. Milan smiled as she conceded defeat. She instructed Chris to name his request as she was prepared to fulfill it. But in exchange, she desired another duel. Chris then responded that a rematch should imply she would also grant him another boon. Milan concurred, stating she would bestow upon him anything he desired. Chris approached her and commanded her to kneel before him. Naturally, Milan was astounded. She informed Chris that it was an unfeasible stipulation, since her allegiance belonged to the Baron family, the primary lineage of the dark magic clan. Chris then apprised her that he was cognizant. She had been dispatched by the principal heir, but if he became the successor, that predicament would be resolved. Milan deemed the notion preposterous, emphasizing that all 5 formally acknowledged successors were lineal descendants of the primary lineage. Well, there's no established precept stating a cadet branch member can't inherit. Is there truly? I embrace your proposition, Lieutenant Commander Chris, he declared. He subsequently suggested scheduling the contest for a month hence, as he required a period for preparation. Although he expressed aspirations for unrestricted engagement next time, Melon cautioned him about his non-existent prospects of triumphing over her without limitations, yet Chris maintained his self-assurance, asserting that a fragile egg could fracture a solid stone. Melon was rendered speechless. Chris then courteously offered his valediction, reiterating that in a month's time, she would discern where her allegiance should rightfully reside. The following day, Chris approached his father and presented him with Melon's endorsement letter. While Earl Kaisar scrutinized it, Chris contended that the knights at the practice field were deficient in rudimentary competencies, and their instruction demanded greater diligence. At that juncture, Earl Kaisar recollected an instance when someone informed him that his son, Christian, possessed exceptional aptitude, effortlessly vanquishing those with strong foundational skills, notwithstanding his inferior standing. Predictably, Earl Kaisar was astonished. He gazed at Chris, who then nonchalantly inquired about the reason. The Earl merely remained silent and promptly bestowed upon him the key to the repository. As agreed, Chris subsequently departed his father's chamber, and upon closing the entrance, he displayed a broad grin, exhilarated by securing access to the archives, and even by having swayed Melon's affections. Melon was a fiend from the Shadowmancy household. Throughout the era of ruin, she ascended to the eminent rank of a 6-star demon, and performed a crucial function in governing the Dark Mages. Chris harbored intentions of acquiring Melon's allegiance regardless of the means. Naturally, he acknowledged her incomplete conversion, but he possessed unwavering confidence that a month would suffice. After all, he possessed extraordinary talent. As he proceeded towards the repository, he reminisced about his father's prior countenance, and reminded himself that even infernal beings must possess familial connections. He then pondered that Earl Kaisar might be a considerably more virtuous individual than his own progenitor from his previous existence. I shall not fail you, Earl Kaisar. No, father, he articulated as he unsealed the archive entrance. Hereditary magic, invocation techniques, and imprecation lore. These were universally deemed prescribed texts within the Luminous faction. Chris retrieved a tome, but abruptly, he noticed Marie. Marie glided towards him, eliciting a startled cry from him. He inquired about her presence within, and Marie divulged that she was originally the curator of this location. She then presumed that Chris intended to monopolize her, as his exclusive handmaiden. Chris was profoundly irritated by her conjectures. He settled down to commence reading, but Marie informed him that his selected grimoire was a quad-stellar level, shadowmancy manuscript titled The Sigil of Confinement. She expressed apprehension that Chris lacked the comprehension at his present expertise. Chris shut the book, folded his arms, and confidently retorted, "That's acceptable. I'm exceptionally gifted. You are aware." Marie paused momentarily before abruptly exclaiming, declaring Chris to be not only aesthetically pleasing, but also intellectually brilliant. Chris became increasingly exasperated by her gauche demeanor. Marie then inquired if a particular motive lay behind his selection of the literature. He offered her a smile and affirmed, "Indeed, it is to ensnare a vermin." The following day, Chris returned to the practice yard, lightly running alongside the other spellcasters, contemplating the rodent he intended to apprehend. His initial suspect was Trin, his younger sibling. Trin harbored the most intense animosity towards him within their household due to his rebellious nature. The secondary suspect was Cox, an individual possessing unrestricted access to the disciplinary chamber. Despite lacking familial ties typically for a thaumaturge, influence would supersede social position. But Cox's conduct, perpetually attempting to appease him, aroused suspicion. A facet of Chris also entertained the notion of an additional entity, operating beyond his awareness. Regardless, it was evident that someone desired his complete deterioration, sufficient to compel him to place the illusory gem within the disciplinary ward. He resolved to feign delinquency, persuaded that the perpetrator would inevitably expose themselves. "Blast it all, this is agonizing," he abruptly exclaimed, halting mid-stride. He departed, lamenting the arduousness of running and declaring his withdrawal. The senior mages exchanged bewildered glances, perplexed by the unfolding events. Meanwhile, during a repast with his father, Chris abruptly shattered his plate. Count Khazar was enraged, but Chris merely rationalized that if the staff had delivered suitable meals, the incident wouldn't have occurred. His father rose, deeming it naive to assume Chris had regained his sanity. He then departed in exasperation. Chris observed his exit, experiencing a faint twinge of remorse, yet reminding himself that these actions benefited the Khazar family. In the ensuing days, Chris endeavored to disseminate whispers that he had reverted to his miscreant behavior. He pestered the domestic help, squandered funds imprudently, and even tried consuming spirits. But Marie intervened, separating the alcohol from the liquor. "Have you chosen to resume a life of delinquency?" she inquired naturally. "It's all right, my dear. I shall remain by your side eternally," Marie reassured. Chris channeled his magic and reminded Marie he'd already informed her of his intention to apprehend a traitor. Marie was astonished that Chris had already achieved mastery of the binding seal. Chris reiterated his genius and divulged that he had altered the incantation for use. Even at a novice magical rank, he perched on his bed amidst a plethora of books, declaring he hadn't simply been idle. He'd been diligently studying sorcery in his leisure. Marie finally conceded his brilliance. At that juncture, Trent burst in unceremoniously. Chris instantly feigned intoxication. Trent was infuriated. "Brother, were you truly only this sort of individual? I believed you'd reformed." Chris grinned, recognizing Trent's genuine ire. This signified his younger brother's innocence. Abandoning his charade, he informed Trent of a potential betrayer within their household. Trent was perplexed and inquired about his meaning. Chris rose and elucidated. "It appears someone desires my downfall once more. I intend to participate in their scheme temporarily." Trent was astounded. So all of this was a pretense? Chris allowed Trent to smell the liquid in his glass, confirming its inauthenticity. Trent then questioned the identity of the household traitor. Chris conceded the difficulty of precise identification, but expressed confidence in the traitor's imminent capture. Just then a servant materialized, alerted by the shattering glass. He inquired about the incident. Chris retorted that the wine was unsatisfactory and demanded Cox's presence for a replacement. The servant informed him of Cox's current engagements. Chris hiccuped and announced his intention to locate Cox personally. He proceeded directly to Cox and slammed the alcohol bottle before him. Cox appeared bewildered. Chris then hurled the alcohol at Cox's head. "Butler, the wine you provided wasn't what I requested." "Are you disregarding me?" Chris accused. Cox promptly stood, refuting any misconduct and pledging to deliver the correct wine. Chris declined, gesturing at Cox and demanding, "Fetch it yourself." Cox trembled with rage but politely acquiesced. Explaining he had pending tasks, Chris touched his face and dismissed Cox. Citing a need to change attire, Cox, still trembling, obeyed. Once Cox departed, Chris glanced at the table, examining a stained document. His eyes brightened upon discovering something pertinent. If Cox was the culprit, then he must have been engaged in administrative matters as well. However, this was insufficient. Chris required concrete proof. He replaced most of the papers, but surreptitiously retained his discovery. Cox returned with the desired wine. Chris expressed gratitude and inquired about Cox's emotional state. Cox prevaricated, claiming he harbored no such feelings towards Chris. Chris then smirked, declaring Cox his preferred butler, despite the circumstances. Cox expressed gratitude, but hesitated before mentioning a desired discussion. Chris granted him permission to speak. Cox explained that Chris had acquaintances who desired a clandestine meeting. At the customary location, he stammered, feigning a suggestion that Chris sever ties with them, yet claiming impartiality. Chris announced his intention to attend, to which Cox smiled and replied, "Certainly I shall adhere to your instructions." Events were progressing more smoothly than Chris anticipated. The following day, Chris encountered his alleged companions. He sat with folded arms, as they relayed rumors of his transformation. Chris observed the adjacent woman, silently replenishing the others' drinks, an action that further exasperated him. His companions hoisted their goblets and beckoned him to imbibe. Chris gradually raised his own glass towards his lips, then abruptly hurled it into the corpulent man's face. The overweight man was infuriated. "What in the devil are you doing? How dare you squander consecrated alcohol?" he bellowed. "Judging by your outburst, it seems you're aware of its contents." Chris retorted icily. He conjured his shadowy magic and applied it to the young lady's brow. As he did, he perceived his comrades gasp in astonishment at his utilization of dark magic. Perched atop the table, Chris sneered and declared, "You should all be more concerned with your own well-being right now." He seized both of the men's heads and smashed their faces upon the tabletop, causing gore to spray as they both implored him to cease. "Why are you doing this? Compose yourself," the portly man pleaded. Chris extracted something from the fabric and stated, "If you can't even deduce why you're being assaulted, then perhaps just expire here." It transpired he had drawn a blade. Chris bound both men with cord and placed the dagger at the center of the slender man's crotch. The thin man instantly confessed that they were merely obeying directives to intoxicate Chris and incriminate the damsel for homicide. The heavy-set man also divulged that they had been coerced with the narcotics they were trafficking. Thus, they had no recourse. Chris then inquired who had issued the command, but they wavered in their response. So Chris brandished the knife once more and questioned if they genuinely desired to be decapitated. The men then disclosed that it was Cox. Naturally, Chris wasn't astonished in the least, as he had already anticipated it. The men pleaded for clemency, but before Chris absolved them, he compelled them to pledge obedience to his every decree. They instantly swore their allegiance, and Chris then employed his dark sorcery, proclaiming he would uphold that oath. The men shrieked in torment as Chris wielded his shadowy power, yanking their heads upward so they could heed his mandate. Afterward, they crumpled to the ground, debilitated. The following day, after the uproar, Cox hastened to Count Khazar and reported that his son, Christian, had perpetrated a murder. Unsurprisingly, the Count was disconcerted upon receiving this news. Cox asserted that Christian had slain a domestic servant, who had been assisting him with his drinking the prior evening, and subsequently discarded the corpse in the river. He even proposed that they could readily conceal the predicament. The Count was enraged with his son, rose to his feet, and commanded Cox to bring Christian to the demonic tribunal, declaring he would invoke the prerogative of summary judgment. Cox subtly grinned upon hearing this. A few moments later, Chris arrived at the infernal court and professed his innocence. The Count, presiding as the magistrate, accused him of prevarication and informed him there was an eyewitness. However, Chris contended that it was inconceivable, as none of the purported murders had actually transpired. He asserted everything was a misapprehension. Abruptly, the courtroom doors swung open, and the very servant they alleged he had murdered entered. Chris smirked and addressed the servant. "Are you suggesting that young woman is deceased?" His deceitful companions in the court were equally stunned, as they had presumed the girl was lifeless. However, the girl proclaimed that Chris had, in fact, escorted her home, after she had fainted, and even provided her with funds for her rent. She then gestured towards Chris's treacherous friends, declaring that they were the true offenders, as they had adulterated Chris's beverage. Chris beamed with contentment and unleashed his dark magic, resolved to bring this spectacle to its culmination. His two false companions were petrified when they were incriminated, but they swiftly lost composure and conceded they had fabricated a false account due to Chris's dark enchantment. They also admitted that Butler Cox had instructed them to frame Chris. "What preposterous accusations, my lord! This is an outrage! The young master and his associates are falsely implicating me!" Cox exclaimed frantically. He then turned to Chris and accused him of orchestrating a dreadful charade. Chris had already foreseen such pronouncements from Cox. "My lord, as the aggrieved party in this matter, may I present a petition?" he inquired. The lord granted him permission to speak. He declared his desire to personally interrogate Cox. Acting under the lord's jurisdiction, Count Khazar was startled by the proposition, but ultimately entrusted the affair to his son, declaring that Cox would testify. However, he cautioned that, if Chris exhibited any unbecoming conduct or utterances, he would instantly rescind his delegation. Chris then assured him it would conclude swiftly. Positioned at the lectern, he proclaimed on behalf of the supreme sovereign of the magic empire, the Demon King himself, as the regent of the eastern sectors of the southern magic kingdoms, a liegeman of the dark magic clan, serving as Count Khazar's representative. I inquired of the accused. Cox now stood in the spot Chris had previously occupied. Chris questioned whether he vowed to utter only the truth in answer to his inquiries, and Cox pledged. Chris reiterated his question, and Cox reaffirmed his oath. Nevertheless, he recoiled as he perceived shadowy magic enveloping him. He groaned in anguish, unable to comprehend the unfolding events. The onlookers were astonished, identifying this magic as the Sigil of Constraint. They were incredulous that such a neophyte had wielded 4-star level dark sorcery. This is an altered sigil of constraint that can be utilized even by individuals with inferior magical ranks. However, there is a prerequisite. It necessitates 2 sworn statements for activation. Chris elaborated, disclosing that Cox had been deceived. Cox trembled. "What are you attempting to do to me?" he stammered. Chris grinned. "You made a pledge to me, correct? To speak nothing but the truth. Now, why did you employ those individuals?" "To falsely accuse me?" Chris inquired. Cox cried out in agony, then ultimately confessed that he had been instructed to do so. His dishonesty had been exposed, and he had been coerced into discrediting Chris. Count Khazar was stunned upon learning this. Chris then divulged that they had already unearthed Cox's treachery, particularly the misappropriation of funds he had perpetrated over an extended duration. He drew nearer and asked Cox who had issued the command. However, Cox pleaded to be spared from responding, as he dreaded the repercussions that awaited him. Because of the sigil of constraint, Chris could inflict tremendous suffering upon Cox without physical contact. Unable to endure the torment, Cox was compelled to divulge the reality. According to his account, he had been directed by Lord Ashdarin, the second heir to the dark magic lineage. Count Khazar and all assembled in the court were in a state of astonishment. Upon hearing the moniker Ashdarin, Cox, grasping the gravity of his admission, endeavored to flee. However, Chris seized a blade from a nearby guard and decapitated Cox. Without a moment's pause, Count Khazar was dumbstruck, and Chris addressed him, stating, "I have executed the judgment upon the wrongdoer," acting under the Count's jurisdiction. His sire then questioned his verdict. Chris clarified that if they had spared Cox's life, the primary family would have tampered with the proof to conceal the affair. He refused to grant them that opportunity. In this manner, all would vividly recall the transpired events. Meanwhile, Trin and Melon, who had been present within the courtroom, observing all, were equally astounded. Chris smiled, reiterating that he had been falsely incriminated by Ashe. Count Khazar was rendered silent. After a brief interval, he employed dark sorcery to conjure a gateway, directing Chris to accompany him as they traversed the portal. They materialized at a clandestine training arena. Chris's father had escorted him here. Due to the excessive scrutiny within the trial chamber, your declaration just moments ago, does it signify your intent to challenge Ashid's claim to leadership? The Count inquired. He elucidated that, endorsing the heir was inextricably linked to their family's influence. While acknowledging the correctness of Chris's choice, he apprehended that it had been overly impulsive. However, given the current circumstances, he had no recourse but to champion the young woman, as the firstborn prince was a sanguinary and deranged individual. Chris smiled and audaciously declared, "I shall become the successor myself." The Count was exasperated and dismissed it as absurd. But according to Chris, if one possesses the aptitude, even a distant relative can be deemed eligible for the right of succession. That is merely a symbolic regulation. Well, if that were indeed the situation, would Ashid have endeavored to frame me? He questioned. They claim your gifts eclipsed Ashid's in your youth. But have you not significantly regressed since then? The Count retorted. Chris was certain he would rapidly recover the lost ground, but he desired his father's endorsement to partake in the song, Hook at the primary residence in 2 months' time. His father then apprised him that only individuals of 2-star rank or higher could be present at the song hook, and he had only just attained 1-star status. Chris then declared he would reach the 2-star echelon within 2 months, and once more implored his father's assistance. Days elapsed, and the domestics of the Khazar estate surmised that Christian Van had undergone a transformation. They had learned that the Count had been providing him with personal instruction recently, and they eagerly anticipated witnessing the duration of Christian Van's perseverance. Chris diligently maintained his training with his father, employing the mudblade technique for mastery and executing strikes with the obsidian blade style. He inquired of his father if his execution was correct, but the Count remained speechless, incredulous that he had already grasped the dark side, swordsmanship in a single attempt. Even though it was instructed, he was astonished when Chris inquired if he needed to execute it in discrete movements, or if a more streamlined method existed, lunging towards the fungus, which he regarded as his adversary. He exhibited the maneuvers from moments prior. That was the Mage technique. But how are the appendages of a human mushroom resilient enough to disregard the Mage technique? Count Khazar questioned. According to Chris's explanation, it was a method of the mid-blade style, a sword art that solely utilizes the edge of the black crescent sword. The Count was awestruck, recognizing this was undoubtedly not a skill a rank 1 could execute. But he betrayed no emotion, composed himself, and conceded its potency, but posited that if Chris employed such a dual methodology, he would struggle to utilize hex magic concurrently. However, Chris declared it was exceedingly simple, and once more, Count Khazar was stunned by the aptitude of his own offspring, who was formerly a delinquent. A fortnight later, Chris felt depleted after sprinting for numerous hours to elevate his rank. He required endurance as a foundation, therefore he couldn't afford to be indolent. Someone drew near, inquiring if he was already fatigued. It was Melon. She stated the contest was imminent, and that she was merely awaiting the appointed day. Regardless of where Chris gazed, the strain emanating from Melon remained intense. He stood and responded, Indeed, I am striving to meet anticipations. Melon then remarked that she could perceive his progress was substantial, but he remained merely at rank 1, and if Chris failed to fulfill expectations, she would never be obligated to genuflect before him. Chris then countered that it was still a mutually beneficial scenario, as he was confident. There was undoubtedly knowledge to be gained from their encounter. Melon departed while chuckling, remarking his audacity remained intact, and urging him to present a formidable challenge, and ensure it was entertaining for her. Chris was cognizant that Melon was rank 4 high tier. Even within rank 1 class, there were subdivisions into high, mid, and low grades. So for Chris, who had just attained rank 1 high tier, it was still a considerable disparity compared to Melon. But he was an affluent young lord, a moneyed combatant, so he was certain he could devise a method to progress more rapidly. The following day, Chris summoned Marie and inquired if she had prepared the excursion pack he had requested previously. Marie affirmed, expressing her enthusiasm, asserting this would be her inaugural outing with the young master, which was why she had ensured meticulous preparations. Chris was startled and informed her he never indicated she would accompany him. Ho, you're apprehensive I might swoon due to the scorching temperature, correct? Dismiss your concerns. Attending to the young master is my privilege, Marie retorted. Chris was irked, questioning why a phantom would collapse. A few days prior, Chris had requested a boon from his father, to substitute his aid with a human, but the Count declined, reminding him he had established a lord-servant pact with Marie. A high-ranking phantom couldn't be governed without a covenant. Chris then inquired how he could dissolve the agreement, but according to the Count, the annulment stipulation was a passionate kiss with Marie, and he appended that Chris had been inebriated when he forged the agreement. Chris was exasperated with his body's previous occupant for being a worthless mischief-maker. Returning to the present, Chris informed Marie that his intended destination was densely populated, making it infeasible to bring her. Marie was dejected, stating she had been anticipating the excursion. Chris then explained that if she unleashed her spectral energy, people would be harmed. Marie nearly wept, telling Chris she had resided in the estate for decades. Chris abruptly felt sympathy for her, Exasperated, he consented to let Marie accompany him, but only if she vowed never to reveal herself to others. Marie then expressed gratitude, deeming him an exceptional young master. Chris then directed her to follow him. As she trailed behind, Marie inquired about their destination. He responded that there was a location where they could generate a handsome profit. Marie then remarked he already possessed ample wealth. Chris retorted irritably that he was aware of that. Marie inquired if he was pursuing gold or property instead of currency. Chris then stated she was mistaken. It was merely something he used to excel at. When they arrived at the carriage, Trin was awaiting. The lad was displeased with his tardiness, but Chris was astonished that Trin was within the carriage, anticipating him. Trin then explained he would monitor him, lest he depart and instigate trouble once more. Chris assured his brother there was no need for concern, as he was merely venturing out for some wagering. He boarded the carriage while proclaiming that fiends should always keep spirits and games of chance close at hand, and even the archdemon himself sanctioned gambling as a respectable leisure activity. Yet Trin desired to accompany him. Chris deduced that Trin harbored concern for his well-being. Trin stammered, refuting any worry for Chris. He rationalized his presence as merely ensuring Chris wouldn't again become a source of shame for their lineage. They subsequently embarked on their journey. En route, Chris offered his brother a knowing smile, internally dismissing him as a gullible simpleton destined to be today's victim. At last, they reached their intended location, positioned outside. Trin expressed astonishment at the existence of such a venue. Chris presented him with a mask, explaining that entry required the concealment of one's identity. Chris then instructed Marie to remain inconspicuous. He beckoned her closer and issued a directive. Marie departed, and Chris proceeded indoors. While his younger sibling inquired about Marie's destination, Chris, however, withheld that information. Upon entering, they drew the attention of the occupants. Numerous players were engrossed in games at each table. Two men engaged in gossip about the newcomers, remarking on their apparent vulnerability. Chris then proposed a wager to Trin, suggesting they bet on their potential winnings within an hour. He declared that if Trin prevailed, he would defer to him as his elder brother for an entire month. However, should Trin lose, he demanded the title of Honorable King, Emperor Majesty Big Brother. He then presented his brother with a sack of coins, offering him the opportunity to withdraw if he felt apprehensive. Trin swiftly seized the money, boldly declaring his lack of fear. He then approached the gamblers to commence playing. Chris, too, began gambling, suffering multiple defeats. "The young gentleman triumphs, my boy. You possess remarkable skill. Continue, and you might amass a fortune tonight," the victor of the previous round commented, placing a hand on Chris's shoulder. In the subsequent round, Chris finally achieved victory. His tactic involved initially allowing his adversaries to win. Then, once their confidence inflated, compelling them to place substantial wagers, a quintessential swindler's ploy. Conversely, Trin endured repeated losses, becoming ensnared by the game. Chris inquired if he wished to conclude the evening and return home. Trin asked if his losses were excessive. Chris responded that he had forfeited a mere 500 rupees. Trin, in contrast, had lost 1,000 rupees. Chris surveyed the surrounding individuals, certain that Trin had been universally designated an easy mark. Chris anticipated imminent and blatant cheating with excessive transparency. "Will you persist in playing?" he inquired as Trin retrieved another money pouch. Trin declared his intention to continue. As he departed, Chris issued a reminder of his prior caution, but secretly welcomed his brother's impending losses, envisioning him as the ideal lure. Trin resumed gambling, oblivious to a figure lurking behind him. Amidst the activity, Chris made an observation, just as Marie returned, reporting the discovery of the individuals he had described. Chris allowed Trin to squander his time gambling, and then proceeded to the location Marie had identified. Upon entering the occupied room, Chris discarded his mask, presuming his recognition within these walls. He was then addressed as Master and questioned regarding the purpose of his visit. "Summon your superior," Chris commanded. Grantel, the leader, the director of the Grantel Trading Company, inquired about Chris's motive for seeking him. This individual was renowned as an astute businessman. However, his true identity was the proprietor of the aforementioned gambling establishment. "You possessed the audacity to defraud my beloved younger brother, and now you feign ignorance," Chris challenged. Grantel then surmised that Chris's brother was the individual wearing the tiger mask at the casino. Chris confirmed his suspicion. His brother was Trin, the inheritor of the House of Khazar. Grantel asserted that his involvement was limited to managing the gambling hall. Therefore, those who deceived Turan were unrelated to him. "Do you yearn for demise?" Marie interjected menacingly. Grantel shrieked and implored Chris for forgiveness, claiming he would have never acted in such a manner had he known the tiger-masked individual was a nobleman from the Count's family. He pleaded for clemency, but Chris informed him that mercy came at a price. Grantel offered to provide restitution. Chris demanded 1 million rupees in compensation. Grantel protested, claiming such a sum exceeded their resources. Chris subsequently reduced the demand to 200,000 rupees. Grantel lamented, stating it represented their entire fortune. Chris smiled slyly and revealed an additional request. He then conferred with Grantel, and upon securing his desired outcome, utilized the 200,000 rupees to acquire combat gear. Marie beamed with pride, and he possessed unwavering faith in his genius. The sole request he made of Grant Hill was a blade, the Gruna, a consecrated sword acquired by a legendary hero who pledged his soul to a demonic entity. Even after the hero succumbed to depravity, it remained in service, a weapon yearned for by infernal beings. But now it was consumed by rust. Chris declared it was acceptable, as he possessed a strategy for its restoration. As they journeyed outwards, Chris unexpectedly bestowed a gift upon Marie, a pendant she had previously admired. Marie was astonished, gazing at her mentor in silent wonder. "You appeared as though you'd be eternally tormented if you didn't obtain it. So I'm merely presenting it to you to aid in your moving forward." "Don't misinterpret my intentions," Chris clarified. "Before my demise and even afterwards, this marks the initial instance I've ever been given a present." "I express my gratitude," Marie responded. Chris then informed her of their imminent departure, and Marie assented with genuine joy, vowing to provide her master with even more delectable blood nectar henceforth. Chris reiterated his refusal to consume it, and Marie divulged that the strawberry beverage he had been imbibing contained a mixture of it. Chris hoped Marie was merely jesting. Abruptly, he sensed he had overlooked something. It materialized that he had forgotten Trin, who was still engaged in play and possessed only a single ruby remaining. The following day, Chris awakened early due to his siblings' outcry. Trin was enraged, questioning why he had deserted him. Chris then comprehended that it was Trin, not Trent, whom he had neglected the previous day. According to Trin, he had nearly been bartered as a destitute, enslaved person, if not for someone fortuitously recognizing him. Chris was yawning, contemplating that Grant Hill might have intervened and rescued Trin. "Incidentally, your manner of addressing me seems somewhat amiss." "Does it not? You forfeited the wager. Therefore you must honor your commitment," he declared, then directed Trin to address him as Honorable King, Emperor Majesty. "Big brother!" Trin trembled with fury. However, an agreement was an agreement, so he compelled himself to address Chris as requested. He stammered while Chris patiently awaited. Trin finally articulated it, albeit with resentment. Chris offered no complaints. He simply grinned while discarding his nasal mucus, and instructed Trin to conduct himself. With appropriate deference for his magnificent sibling, Trin pivoted to depart. But prior to his exit, he angrily proclaimed that his brother would soon lament this day. Chris merely observed him and offered a faint smile, recalling that Trin, an endearing youth, would eventually mature and slay his brother Christian. However, he deduced it might be attributed to Ashid's machinations. Ashid is the offspring of Longam, the interim leader of the Dark Mage clan and the highest-ranking successor. Chris harbors no particular sentiments regarding this, as he is not the authentic Christian. But if he aspires to become the heir, he cannot evade a confrontation with Ashid. Furthermore, he was inclined to avenge the grievance on behalf of the genuine Christian. To achieve this, he needed to secure Melon's allegiance first. Currently, his gaze was fixated on the Gruna. After an hour elapsed, Chris seized the Gruna. He recollected that numerous mages had previously challenged this hallowed sword, yet the reason it remained accumulating dust like an archaic relic was their collective failure to subdue it. Chris desired to witness its reaction to him if he attempted to utilize it. He conjured dark magic, but the enchantment instantly dissipated. Naturally, Chris anticipated Gruna's adverse reaction to the magical power, but he understood it was crafted to channel the divine power of light. Thus, it was expected. Nevertheless, ultimately, it was merely an instrument. And if he deciphered and deconstructed the pattern that repelled magic, he was certain he could eventually achieve the feat. He grasped the hammer and commenced wielding it. With each strike, a flash of lightning materialized. Chris opted to switch to another weapon and continued wielding it. He was grinning as he did so, declaring his readiness to continue swinging throughout the night. Several days later at the clandestine training grounds, Count Khazar inquired about his preparedness. He affirmed his readiness, but expressed curiosity about the lady accompanying him. However, the silhouette evoked a sense of familiarity. The lady rotated and regarded him. He then greeted her with a salutation. "Greetings, Commander of the Black Shadow Knights." The lady responded in kind. "Indeed, it has been some time, nephew." She was Mary, the leader of the Black Shadow Knights, daughter of the Dark Mage clan's chieftain, Mark Longom, and Count Khazar's blood sister. She is a staunch supporter of the clan leader and oversees clandestine operations and internal monitoring, a veritable force to be reckoned with amongst the Dark Mage fraternity. Chris was baffled as to the woman's purpose for visiting, and according to Count Khazar, Mary's arrival was due to the Cox affair. The youngster's behavior was rather audacious. "Wouldn't you agree, Mary?" she inquired. Chris became apprehensive, suspecting that the head of the clan meant to safeguard Ashid. He offered Mary a smile, remarking that the clan leader must possess ample leisure time, if he was concerning himself with a matter as insignificant as the Cox predicament, and involving himself in such trifling affairs. Mary retorted that he was excessively impudent, and apprised Chris that the clan leader held no interest in the children's trivial altercations, but was intrigued by him. Chris was astonished by this revelation. He perceived it as an opportunity to capture the clan leader's attention. According to Mary, she couldn't discern if Chris was valiant or merely foolhardy, as he hadn't even attained the 2nd star rank, yet had dared to challenge Melon to a duel. She recommended that Chris retract his challenge while there was still time, but Chris declined, harboring a strategy. He was gripping the Gruna sword at his hip, and the woman immediately recognized it. "Boy, you've gone completely mad!" "I acknowledged your recklessness, but I underestimated its extent," she declared with exasperation. She then accused Count Khazar of boasting, that his Christian had finally regained his sanity. The Count vehemently swore the truth of his prior statement. The woman continued, revealing Christian's intention to utilize the sacred blade in the duel. Chris countered that there was no prohibition against it, and the method was irrelevant as long as victory was achieved. The woman reminded him that the Gruna was a weapon, that even the clan leader had been unable to command, and she was certain its divine energy would incinerate Chris. Chris unveiled the Gruna sword. He instructed Mary to observe closely, but Mary fell silent upon seeing its damaged state. She questioned its authenticity, and Chris invited her to examine it herself. He tossed it to Mary, and as she grasped it, it repelled her dark magic. She immediately discarded it. "How did you accomplish this?" she inquired. Chris responded that it was a confidential technique he couldn't divulge. He rested the Gruna on his shoulder and proclaimed, "But one thing is undeniable. I am a prodigy, capable of wielding a blade that even the clan leader couldn't subdue. That's the long and short of it." His father beamed with pride. Suddenly, laughter erupted as someone approached. It was Melon who declared, "You truly are amusing, young master. Quite impressive that you managed to tame the holy sword. However, it's inconsequential. This will be your final day regardless." Chris regarded her with an impassive expression. The scene abruptly shifts to the commencement of the duel, as Melon lunges forward with a downward swing. Chris parries the blow, "Just as I suspected," he mutters. Unfettered, her strength and velocity are unparalleled. Bridging this disparity will be impossible. But as she initiates her aerial assault, he once again deflects her attack. The holy sword begins to dissipate, the aura emanating from her blade. His father and aunt express astonishment as it counteracts the dark energy. Raiden remarks, "It appears he surpassed her younger self." Marin interjects, "That's not the culmination." She gestures, emphasizing, "He's wielding the holy sword." A purple aura still lingers around his hand, but it clashes visibly with the sword's aura. Chris retaliates, forcing Melon to block. Raiden exclaims, "The power is phenomenal!" But his dark energy seems somewhat unstable. Marin corrects him, "That's a misinterpretation." He's momentarily suppressing his dark energy to circumvent the holy sword's rejection. Melon retreats. Chris inquires, "Is the battle to your satisfaction?" She responds, "A suspicion has been forming. Are you perchance anticipating my actions?" He replies, "I do possess a keen eye for detail. Every sword technique has a preparatory stance. You must lift your arms before executing a downward strike. To achieve that, specific muscles in your shoulders and torso must be engaged. This principle applies to both novices and masters." She sighs. "How do you intend to foresee such minute movements?" A green aura emanates from her hand, enveloping Chris. She states, "Surely, you haven't overlooked that black swamp knights are spellblades?" A potent surge of holy energy radiates from him. "That was almost troublesome," he remarks. "Do you possess a purification artifact?" she asks. Chris expresses gratitude to his father, declaring, "I survived thanks to you," but he claims it should be in the secured vault. And he appears perplexed. Chris admits he can't resist being a bit of a pilferer at times, but possessing superior gear is an advantage in actual combat. He retrieves an object from his pocket and hurls it towards Melon. As it detonates, she desperately attempts to evade the projectile, and Chris declares her efforts are futile. He launches another directly at her. This one bursts. He boasts that he acquired the relic using the funds he swiped from Gurley, and it's quite potent. He asserts that he knows she's alive and commands her to reveal herself. She lunges, thrusting her blade directly towards him. Chris parries with his blade, intercepting hers precisely at the tip, making it fracture and splinter into fragments. Raiden muses that he questioned why Chris tossed the corrosive sphere into the air, and that just as he suspected, his offspring is indeed a prodigy, and that it's exactly as he surmised, his son is truly brilliant. Melon advances, chuckling. She then beams, exclaiming that this is immensely enjoyable, inquiring what he'll utilize next. Marin panics, declaring Melon has gone insane and they must restrain her. Chris leans back and then lifts his hand, repelling her assault with the slightest of gestures. He swiftly pivots, positioning himself behind her, blade against her throat. Startled, she hears him pronounce his triumph. He inquires if she's content with the outcome. The blade grazes her cheek, drawing a small amount of blood. His father continues to beam with pride. "I adore this man," Melon chuckles. Questioning if he's genuinely posing that question, she confesses she can no longer contain her excitement. He reiterates his desire for a response to his prior inquiry. He requests a prompt reply, and despite his victory, he will honor her decision if she declines. As allegiance cannot be coerced, she asks if should she remain by his side. Will he continue to engage her in combat like this? Clasping her hand, he vows to fight her as often as she desires. Later, Marin gazes at the sunset. She remarks that his command of shadowy energy is exceptional. A man casts the sacred blade upon the earth. He declares his refusal. Marin inquires if he too is incapable of wielding it. He confirms he can hold it briefly, but as she's aware, the currents of dark energy are in constant flux, necessitating continuous manipulation into a form, undetectable by the blade. But such a feat is impossible in actual combat. Perhaps only a denizen of Gehenna or the demonic dragon could achieve it. Failing them, perhaps a deranged individual, capable of manipulating dark energy as effortlessly as breathing. She recollects Chris's broad smile. He asks if his performance merited her commendation. She appears pleased. She muses that perhaps her father's long-standing aspiration might be realized. In the kitchen, a sinister-looking man meticulously chops ingredients. He bisects a strawberry and positions it atop a cheesecake. Chris expresses his disbelief that he's been preparing the strawberry cakes. Mary notes that despite his appearance, his culinary abilities are exceptional. The York inquires about Chris's presence in the kitchen. Chris states his intention to bake cookies. Mary questions his motive for baking cookies. Chris explains he intends to give them to someone. She asks if they're for another woman. He assures her it's not what she suspects, but technically they are for a woman. The York offers to assist him, but Chris declines. He explains that personally preparing heartfelt treats is what truly matters, and that he may not appear to be, but before he can complete his statement, a crimson substance splatters against his cheek. Orcs are in a frenzy, pulverizing strawberries into a pulpy jam. Chris asks Mary if she's certain they aren't adulterating the strawberry juice with blood. She laughs. Later that evening, Chris calls out to Marin, who is about to mount a horse. She inquires as to the reason. He explains he heard of her departure and came to bid her farewell. She expresses her gratitude and suggests he must be fatigued from yesterday's duel. He denies any weariness, but presents her with a small gift. Observing the cookies, she blushes, stating a gift wasn't necessary. He expresses his joy at seeing her again and confesses he felt compelled to prepare something. He recalls yesterday when Chris inquired about Marin's culinary preferences. He remarks that Chris certainly understands how to win someone over. Chris urges her to sample a cookie as he baked them himself. She questions if he truly made them and begins to eat them enthusiastically. Upon understanding that this item is actually gaseous, she informs him it's quite delectable, and he expresses his pleasure at her enjoyment. She declares that she must offer him something in exchange for this generous present. Inquiring if there's anything he desires, he states his wish for her to become his genuine aunt henceforth. She remarks that since they're already kin by blood, she's certain there's a profounder significance behind his words. She questions if he simply seeks her backing in the imminent inheritance dispute. She sighs but states regrettably she cannot fulfill his petition. As he might be aware, grown-ups from the primary family must remain unbiased toward the contenders, as that is the established protocol. He claims he was merely making an earnest request, as he yearns to foster a closer relationship with his aunt. She inquires if he truly harbors no ulterior motives, and he responds affirmatively. If she holds affection for him and covertly proposes assistance, he wouldn't be capable of declining it. She chuckles, commencing to consume the cookies, stating that she doesn't find his candor objectionable. But since her nephew bakes such exquisite cookies and presents them to her, she's compelled to cherish him. He expresses gratitude, and she inquires about the possibility of more cookies next time. Raiden sits there, eyes welling up, finding the scene incredibly heartwarming. Chris warns that if she upsets him, his skills might diminish, rendering him incapable of replicating this flavor. He adds that she surely comprehends his implication. She sighs, a joyful expression on her face, and asks for his thoughts on enlisting in the Black Shadow Knights. He begins to elaborate and convey something to her, but she interjects. She remarks on his exceptional performance in the duel against Melon, suggesting he might be an even greater talent than the senior clan leader. Nevertheless, his adversaries will not be pushovers, and she's apprehensive that he might falter before his aptitude has an opportunity to flourish. He counters that if he falters in surmounting the obstacles in this manner, he wouldn't object to perishing. She appears astonished by this declaration. He expresses gratitude for her solicitude, but asserts his belief that he won't be defeated again. She's entertained by his self-assurance and admits that, inexplicably, when it comes to this particular child, she's inclined to believe him. She acknowledges her inability to deter him from pursuing this course, but wishes to impart a piece of counsel. She cautions him to be wary of the first young lady. Raiden questions the need for caution regarding Juliana, asserting that she's the most amiable of the 5 young lords. Marin assures him that he will eventually comprehend the reason. Chris expresses gratitude, stating he'll bear it in mind. She smiles, bids him farewell, and departs. The scene transitions to Chris lying in bed, lost in thought. He reflects on the formidable power of both his father and aunt, having attained 6 stars. Yet he heard little of them during the Great War, and ponders the sheer number of formidable combatants within the Magic Empire. There must be a sufficient number to overwhelm the Dominion of Light, at the minimum. However, he's determined not to relive the past. Therefore, he must accelerate his own growth. A full month elapses. Chris inquires whether his father summoned him. His father confirms, stating he had something to convey, but is then taken aback by something. He asks Chris if he's truly attained 2 stars already. His father exclaims that such rapid advancement in a mere month is astonishing. Chris questions his surprise, reminding him of his promise, and inquires about the topic his father wished to discuss. The reason for summoning him alone at this hour. His father reveals that he received news from the main family. He submitted both him and Thurn as contenders for the hallowed Dark Rite, but only Thurn was accepted. He sighs, attributing the rejection to his reckless expenditures, promiscuity, larceny, and even intoxicated property damage. He admits his inability to dispute these accusations due to their veracity. He's facing repercussions. However, his father expresses disbelief at the disrespect shown towards his son. Chris inquires if Viscount Langham made this judgment. His father denies this. The Viscount remained relatively silent after his wrongdoings. The decision came from Leon de Baron. He's a direct lineage of the main family, and the leading figure in the approaching Sacred Dark Rite. The Sacred Dark Rite itself is a ceremony where participants absorb pure darkness from the negative realm. Due to its limited quantity, participants engage in a near-death battle to establish a hierarchy. Higher-ranking participants absorb more darkness, significantly influencing the selection process for the Young Lord. If Lion triumphs and monopolizes the darkness, becoming the 6th Young Lord, and attaining his objective will become considerably more challenging. Should that occur, his father pledges to address the matter again, and as a last resort, he'll even seek assistance from Marin. Chris asserts that's unnecessary, as he'll resolve the situation independently. His father acknowledges his talent and transformation, but insists he leave these issues to the grown-ups. He's genuinely striving to be a good father. Even Chris recognizes this and expresses gratitude for his concern. However, he informs him that he has his own approach. He's clearly devising a cunning plan. He inquires if any descendants of Count Trayman's household will be participating. His father confirms, stating his third son will be present. And that rascal sided with Lion, declaring he had no entitlement to partake in the dark ritual. He's merely a charlatan who can only command demonic creatures. Chris remarks on his surprising paternal affection and advises him to relax, as he simply needs to demonstrate his capabilities. He adds that the Trayman family should be conducting a black pill expedition soon, and he'll join as a herder. The scene shifts to what appears to be the family's primary estate. Marine states she personally evaluated Christian. As per the clan's directive, he inquires about his condition. She declares him unparalleled to his peers. The elder expresses skepticism. The child he recalls was a spoiled brat, who considered himself a genius when he was merely a fraudulent prodigy. She insists he's markedly different now. The elder then inquires, specifically, if she believes the child could satisfy his long-held aspiration. She explains this desire is her father's reason for clinging to life, even rejecting death through celestial means. In defiance of magic, she admits uncertainty, but he might be the closest to fulfilling his ambition. He chuckles, finding it intriguing, and declares he'll observe him closely. He deems his participation in the approaching sacred dark rite improbable, seeking her confirmation. She confirms it's the general agreement within the clan. She questions if he will intercede. He states he can't interfere in such a trivial affair. He questions how one could claim the title of a ferocious beast without conquering such a minor challenge. She argues that while he may be a ferocious beast, he remains a mere child. She believes he deserves a chance to embrace darkness and unlock his potential. He sharply addresses her, his voice stern and his gaze piercing. She realizes she's exceeded her bounds. He remarks on his consistent demeanor, always demanding of those he holds in high regard. He deduces that her fervent advocacy stems from fondness. He then summons Blood Drinker. The head butler of the dark magic clan, Simon, appears. He inquires about his summons. The elder states Simon already overheard everything. Simon confirms his presence. He's instructed to merely observe the little bastard. The elder confirms, wanting a detailed account of his actions. Leading up to the sacred dark rite, Simon agrees, but requests permission for a minor prank during his surveillance. The elder grants his request cautiously. He wants to know every detail of his actions in the lead-up to the sacred dark rite. Simon confirms his understanding, but has a single inquiry. He asks if he can indulge in a small jest during his observation. Marin appears taken aback, and the elder scowls. He's reminded not to overstep his boundaries. Simon laughs malevolently and agrees, then departs. As he exits, Marin expresses hope for Chris's safety. The scene transitions to a carriage traversing a village. Chris remarks on his rapid attainment of 2 stars. He attributes it to his innate abilities, but despite rigorous training, his endurance and dark energy reserves remain inadequate. He cannot advance to 3 stars in his current state. He requires a black pill to rapidly amass dark energy. He considers the Trayman's coincidental conflict with him fortunate. The organizers of the Black Pill Hunt initiating a feud with him is a stroke of luck. However, capturing the demon beast Kagite doesn't guarantee a black pill. As the carriage halts, he clarifies that a specific prerequisite must be met. Lardass approaches the carriage, inquiring about Chris's presence. Chris exchanges pleasantries, assuming he hasn't arrived empty-handed. He confirms he brought a gift, as he'd never greet the young master without one. Chris slaps it away, sending it tumbling to the ground, leaving Lardass bewildered. Chris accuses him of forgetting his position and engaging in illicit activities. A comical image of Chris tormenting him as a penguin appears. Chris decides to overlook it this time, warning him to cease any transgressions. He should discontinue any actions that overstep the boundaries. Lardos concurs, and Chris mentions needing something. He requests Lardos to obtain an ash pill for him, inquiring if it's possible. Lardos explains their recent price surge. Chris acknowledges the situation and checks Mary's readiness. She erupts in laughter, shockingly. He urges her to compose herself and asks for Marriott. Pitying Lardos, he immediately grovels, promising instant retrieval. Chris remarks on the ease of cooperation. He adds another request while Lardos is at it. He desires a dagger capable of piercing armor. Lardos appears perplexed as Chris departs. The unfortunate man isn't virtuous. Remember this as they return? Mary inquires about going home. Chris states having one more destination. Spotting a potion shop, he instructs the driver to halt. He browses, claiming everything. Mary questions his intentions. Chris claims to have a purpose. She probes about the aphrodisiac's use. She misinterprets the situation. Under their gazes, Chris perspires nervously. She considers it might be their time. He denies it. She feigns understanding. He reiterates it's not for him, but for someone else. She subtly strikes a JoJo pose, asking if it's for the Count. Chris affirms, and the shopkeeper comprehends, attributing it to Ryden's age. Chris urges secrecy for the Count's honor. The shopkeeper assures discretion. He promises caution. Later, Thorn greets Chris. Chris requests his title and addresses him, hitting the nail on the head. He mentions the Black Pill Hunt's dangers, advising caution. Chris questions Thorn's concern. Thorn expresses worry about their duel. Thorn is utterly embarrassed. The Count urges Chris to humiliate the house tyrants. Those tyrannical bastards. Chris agrees. He promises good news. Their father questions Thorn about the previous King-Emperor remark, the earlier Emperor-King comment. Thorn becomes deeply embarrassed. Dismissing its importance, the scene shifts to Count Tyrion's residence. A small goblin declares, for the last time, that Chris is forbidden from the Count's mansion. The boys defend Chris, expressing disbelief. They question the goblin's awareness of Chris's identity. The goblin cites the young master's orders, refusing favors to a worthless scoundrel. Chris infers he needs to find his own lodging. The goblin nervously confirms. A boy threatens to decapitate the goblin. Chris intervenes, inquiring about payment. The frightened goblin suggests billing Count Tyran. Chris questions this, revealing a lavish courtyard. He rented a magnificent mansion. The workers speculate about the cost, estimating at least 100,000 rupees. Chris remarks on the rare opportunity to spend freely. With someone else's funds, he grants an hour for luggage organization, followed by drinks. Movement stirs in the luggage. Chris notes the sound. Mary emerges, praising the mansion's grandeur and its suitability for serving him. Chris questions her presence. She reveals hiding in his luggage, upholding her maid's vow. She finds his shyness endearing. His expression betrays him. He clearly missed her. Someone yells, demanding explanation about the bill. Yahello is introduced. Count Taiyan's third son. Chris explains, following instructions, to find separate lodging. He questions the problem. He justifies purchasing a suitable mansion instead of a mere hotel. He dismisses monetary concerns, calling Yahello pathetic for mistreating guests. He considers it a cheap lesson in manners. Yahello, enraged, crumples the paper, conjuring a panther with a spell. Upon encountering a leopard, he inquires if Chris desires death. Chris speculates that this must be the Count's method of subjugation. Distinct from the Alliance's domestication techniques, these subjugation methods constitute a sinister magic. This dark art restrains and dominates the monstrous creature. Through terror, there are clandestine recipes, covertly combined, that cripple the beast's cognitive functions and induce hallucinations, dread, and agitation. However, it's somewhat more intricate than he anticipated. Therefore, mastering it swiftly is improbable. But for the present, he intends to thoroughly thrash it. Chris informs Mary that to eliminate the menacing feline, he undoubtedly requires a weapon. She chuckles, unveiling their small repository, from which he retrieves it, provoking Yahello to attack. Yahello protests against being commanded. As the creature charges directly towards him, it gapes its maw and lunges. Chris raises his staff, parrying the assault. As it attempts to bite, the staff splinters. The staff breaks, sending Chris sprawling backward. Chris remarks that it's not terrible, but a 2-on-1 fight is unfair and unacceptable. Victory mandates his participation as a guard, not a heather, and the stakes must be high enough to make ends meet. He asks for Yahello's opinion. Yahello labels him an arrogant scoundrel while leaping onto the leopard, vowing to force him to his knees. As it prepares for a second strike, Yahello appears assured as it lands on the ground. But the leopard peers beneath its paws, searching for Chris. Even Yahello joins the search as Chris appears from behind, striking him once, then rapidly delivering 3 more blows with the stick. Chris mockingly asks if it hurts, warning him not to cry. Yahello retreats, and Chris promises no leniency. Despite Yahello's protests, Chris remains relentless. Chris emanates a potent killing intent towards Yahello and the leopard. The leopard instantly succumbs to terror and panics. Retreating in fear, Yahello, left standing, demands to know what Chris did to his choco. Chris reveals he merely employed a basic 2-star illusion spell. Apparently, it overwhelmed his subjugation techniques. Yahello begins preparing another incantation, silencing Chris once more. As a menacing-looking steed materializes from beneath the earth. Chris questions if Yahello understands his true nature. A bewildered Yahello is struck in the forehead by Chris's swiftly thrust weapon. The blow knocks Yahello unconscious. Chris explains that he doesn't wait for transformations or spellcasting. Meanwhile, the horse struggles to emerge from the ground. The scene shifts to Chris gambling, as others question his actions. They express doubt about his choices. Chris argues that ample time remains and rest can wait. They point out that he's currently not resting. Chris defends his right to act as he pleases, fulfilling his supposed role. He seeks Mary's agreement. She happily concurs, conditional on his abstinence from alcohol. Chris desires real alcohol, but she refuses. He's unable to refuse her. The goblin from before questions Alo's reasons for monitoring such a scoundrel. Chris invites them to join him, confident that their master won't awaken until morning, having been thoroughly beaten. He offers to keep their presence a secret, inquiring about their thoughts. They rebuff him, and he tells them to enjoy observing him. Their surveillance continues until nightfall. The goblin and hyena observe Chris. Convinced of his worthlessness, they deem further observation unnecessary. As they depart, Chris opens his eyes, noticing their absence. He sits up. Looking out the window, he declares it's time to depart. He informs Mary the goat of his need to leave briefly, forbidding her to follow. She becomes suspicious, revealing her knowledge of the aphrodisiac in his pouch. She accuses him of intending to use it himself, not on the count. She laments her inability to join him in bed, but offers encouragement for his nocturnal endeavors. He criticizes her talkativeness. He asserts that things are PG at night in the Kitten Mountains. Chris identifies this as the Count's clandestine territory. The demonic energy here is potent, befitting the Count's reputation. He anticipates reaching the hunting ground soon. He locates it. However, he observes only 2 sentinels, remarking that this situation is quite relaxed, and it's fortunate he acquired the cloaking enchantment from Mary. She inquires about his intentions with the invisibility sorcery, and he counters with why she's perpetually complicating matters. Chris strolls past them effortlessly, venturing further into the hunting domain. He discovers a shrine indicating that this location will host the culmination of the Black Pill quest, and it's as unsettling as rumored. We observe the vixen-like maiden from earlier, explaining that the method to procure a black pill involves compelling a Kagaroth to sacrifice itself to him. In essence, he must instill such terror that it prefers death, similar to how polarities intertwine. Profound dread and ecstatic delight occupy the same continuum. In that fleeting instant, the futile ash pill metamorphoses into the black pill. Therefore, the house of Count Tyran, renowned for subduing demonic creatures through fear, orchestrates the black pill pursuit. Chris acknowledges understanding, and we discover the girl's name is Lena. He affirms that, as she previously indicated, he intended to pilfer their paramount technique and unleash the Kagaroth after administering an aphrodisiac, concocted with various ingredients, thus monopolizing the black pill. However, insufficient time remains to purloin and master their technique. Consequently, he must employ an alternate approach. He detects a magical incantation and turns, questioning if he's been discovered, only to pinpoint its origin. He concludes that investigation is necessary. Venturing deeper into the woods, he encounters a cavern and dons his hood before entering. As he does, a menacing crimson aura grazes him. He remarks on its potent malevolence and instantly recognizes a high-ranking barrier of dark sorcery. He ponders if it's what he suspects, a fissure of Ganagana, the demonic realm, and he's astonished by its presence. Connecting it to the human world, he contemplates luring the Kagaroth there, possessing the means to do so. Smiling, he decides to await the hunt. A bat observes him from above. As Chris departs, it unfurls its wings, revealing Simon, who remarks on the little rascal's unexpected intrigue. Not only did he thrash Alo, but he also lulled his observers into complacency with his feigned foolishness. He clandestinely infiltrated a restricted zone, plotting something. This inspires Simon to devise a more devious trick. Approaching Ganagana's gate, he inserts his hand, causing it to bleed and spill onto the ground. Something absorbs his blood and inquires about his desire. Simon prepares to conjure a demon. The following day, as the hunt commences, someone plants a banner into the earth. It's none other than Alo, accompanied by his group. Chris, also present, remarks on Alo's exaggerated swagger. After his recent defeat, Alo retorts, calling Chris the poser, and questioning the Holy Sword's presence if he can't wield it. Chris claims its superior efficacy to a club, offering Alo a taste. Alo redirects the discussion, instructing everyone to lure the Kagaroth to the altar. Those assigned to sentry duty will accompany him, remaining nearby. Simon observes, and Chris notices him. Alo instructs Chris to proceed, and Chris complies. At the altar, another guard suggests Chris relocate, as he's hindering the hunt. Chris agrees to relax, but warns against seeking his assistance with cleanup when they inevitably fail. This angers the guard, but Alo advises against preemptive exhaustion. He assigns Chris, the incompetent one, to guard the flag. This line was already modified in a previous turn. Please provide the original line for modification. Chris vows to diligently protect the flag. Chris settles by a tree, expressing a desire to witness their efforts. As they're unknowingly falling into his snare, he confirms bringing the dagger and ash pill. While they search for the sound, Chris senses its approach. We finally encounter the Kagharoff, a rank 4 magical beast. He's amused by its unexpectedly goofy and endearing appearance. The others inquire about Aelo's readiness, declaring it's time. His bestial instincts urge him to commence the subjugation ritual. Aelo extends his hand, initiating the incantation. As the Kagharoff pecks the ground, the others cast a slowing spell upon it. As Aelo gradually nears it with the subduing technique, a transformation occurs within the Kagharoff's gaze, provoking a shrill shriek from the creature. It swivels its head towards Aelo. Aelo, appearing frightened, lifts his hand, only to be utterly clobbered, sending him crashing to the ground. Everyone else perceives the venom emanating from its tiny plumage and tentacle-like appendages. They hastily form a protective barrier around Aelo, but Chris declares it futile. He explains it's uncontrollable due to the aphrodisiac he administered, Aelo adds, that it's fortunate they ingested the antidote beforehand. However, prolonged exposure remains perilous, and everyone must exert their utmost effort to subdue it. They launch themselves airborne, charging directly towards Aelo once again, their cries for him echoing. Terror-stricken Aelo looks upward, squeezing his eyes shut, only to be met with an unexpected sight. Chris stands before him, wielding the sacred blade. Intercepting the assault, he scoffs at their pathetic display, incredulous that the occupied standard-bearer was compelled to intervene. He offers to rescue him if Aelo addresses him as Big Brother. Aelo retorts, questioning his sanity. Chris inquires if he genuinely refuses. Time, he emphasizes, is of the essence. The others succumb to coughing fits from the toxins. Aelo, gnashing his teeth, concedes and pleads for assistance. Chris, calling him a scoundrel, reminds him of his promise and strikes the Kagharoff's head. He then employs his personal variation of the subduing techniques, enveloping the Kagharoff, restraining it. A bewildered Aelo questions his ability. Chris counters, challenging the assumption that his family held exclusive rights to its usage. He dismisses non-secret techniques, declaring something like the intermediate subduing technique trivial. Pivoting his body, he seizes the chains conjured by the technique, yanking them like reins and leaping onto the Kagharoff's back. It screeches and bolts, prompting Aelo to shout, a warning about an approaching chasm. As Aelo cautions him, Chris smiles, revealing his prior knowledge from the previous night. He charges directly towards it. The Kagharoff thrashes wildly, and Chris proclaims that it's likely the creature's first encounter with Gehenna's malevolence. He commands the Kagharoff to cower in fear. Its crimson eyes morph into a vibrant yellow. Chris seizes the moment, tightening his grip on his dagger, and plunges it into the Kagharoff, slaying it instantly. The others rush in, inquiring about his well-being, and cautioning him about the cave's extreme peril. They urge a swift retreat. Chris chides their timidity and questions their course of action. Had it been a gray pill instead of a black one? Frustration consumes Aelo, and his companion demands to know Chris's intentions. He blames Chris's intervention, but Aelo interjects, silencing him. He addresses Chris, expressing gratitude for rescuing his subordinates. He acknowledges Chris's role in minimizing their injuries. Chris expresses surprise at Aelo's admission. He confesses to feeling a pang of guilt, amplified by the knowledge of the pill swap. Nevertheless, he must fulfill his obligations. He reminds Aelo of his promise to address him as Big Brother. Chris presses Aelo to honor his word. Aelo denies making such a pledge, citing their age difference. The cave trembles violently, knocking people off their feet with intense force. Aelo demands an explanation, and Chris begins to comprehend the situation. As two colossal blue eyes materialize before them, anxiety washes over Chris. As a monstrous voice expresses delight at finding a new plaything, Chris identifies it as a demon from Gehenna. Trembling with dread, Aelo implores Chris to flee, urging him to prioritize his own safety as an outsider. Chris spots Simon on the ceiling and flicks his wrist, launching his dagger directly at him. It pierces Simon, or rather what appears to be Simon. It's revealed to be his familiar used for surveillance. As the connection weakens, a startled Simon questions when Chris detected him. He reveals his plan to intervene after a period of observation. With his bat clone intended for teleportation destroyed, it will require a minimum of 5 minutes to reach the location, even with blood magic pushed to its absolute limits. And should he arrive too late, everyone will perish. He promptly departs, and it appears he's not malevolent, simply intending to pull a jest. As he stated, the devil finds this intriguing, inquiring about Chris's scheme. Chris responds, expressing his dislike for surreptitious observation. The demon chuckles, remarking on his surprising anxieties for a deceased individual. Chris counters that compared to the devils, encountered during the era of devastation, this one would be considered low-ranking. However, he's at least a 5-star, and currently an insurmountable foe. Raising a finger skyward, he declares it's not entirely dire, as he casts the same enchantment to slumber the others, just like he did with the young lady, when Lordos and Palamador attempted her assassination. Alo's companions begin to faint. Alo exclaims, demanding to know his intentions when unity is crucial. Chris notes his impressive magical resilience, and strikes him squarely in the abdomen, urging him to succumb to sleep. It seems he just ended his life. The demon inquires if they will be offered to him, promising to grant Chris reprieve and a personal benediction in return for the immolations. Chris silences him, stating his refusal to consort with devils. He commences drawing the sacred blade. Recognizing it, the demon deems the notion laudable. But an unusable holy sword is mere refuse. He initiates a spell, launching it directly at Chris. He deflects it with his sword, but it's insufficient, propelling him into the cavern wall, rendering him insensible. The demon seizes his arm, hoisting him aloft, offering a chance to present them as an offering. Then he'll preserve his paltry existence. Chris spits at him, questioning the assumption of his inability to wield the holy sword. Breaking free, he clutches the demon's legs. Flipping onto the ground, he activates his other energy core, restoring the holy sword's tip with aura. The demon appears apprehensive, questioning how a fiend can command the power of light. Chris asks if he finally senses peril. The demon insists this won't deter him, conjuring a massive crimson sphere before Chris. Chris braces himself, widening his stance and shouting, unleashing Dead Sea cleaving light with a downward sword swing. A tremendous golden wave surges towards the demon. The demon expresses disbelief as the attack lands, eliciting a shriek. Presumably vanquished, the demon collapses. Chris's eyes betray exhaustion. He admits to overexertion, his vision narrowing progressively. He stumbles, losing consciousness. His past life emerges. Evan inquires if he truly replicated his aptitude. Chris confirms its semblance. Evan acknowledges his exceptional talent. He explains Dead Sea cleaving light, literally, represents the flash dividing the Dead Sea. Ironically, despite mastering the technique, he failed to illuminate the Mirror Clan. But Chris will undoubtedly become the world's savior. A cerulean finger grazes a puddle. Chris remains near death. The woman expresses intrigue. She introduces herself as Methena, Gehenna's 7th Realm's first seat. Reinforcements arrive at the cavern, bearing healing potions. As Chris closes his eyes, Methena anticipates his future endeavors. The scene shifts to Count Timon's manor. Chris complains of a headache, lamenting 2 days of wasted time. Yet his body feels well. He remains physically sound. He searches for the black pill, finding it beside him with relief. He recalls Methena, deeming her attention undesirable. Precocious fiends sometimes receive demonic boons and rapid development. He dismisses it as a villain's reward. A 7th world demon wouldn't be particularly powerful anyway. A leonine figure enters, inquiring about Chris's health. He's introduced as House Tyrion's patriarch. Chris greets the Count, attempting to rise and bow. The Count advises rest. Chris wonders about the situation. He's informed that an investigative team explored the cavern yesterday. It appears someone interfered with the magical barrier, the one that safeguards the gateway to Gehenna. Luckily, it seems the Sovereign of Hell was accidentally summoned back in the interim. But regardless of how brief the occurrence, it was ample time for everyone to perish. Chris ponders if they genuinely think it was an accidental summoning. But it's illogical, because it would be challenging for them to even entertain the notion that he vanquished it, since he doesn't require a fabrication. That's advantageous. The Earl states he wishes to commence with an expression of remorse. He regrets handling him so disgracefully, relying solely on the hearsay of him being useless. He then inclines, conveying his gratitude, proclaiming him a patron of House Tyrone, and he is indebted to him. Chris assures him it's unnecessary, and as an affiliate of the Shadow Magic clan, he simply fulfilled his obligation, as they are kindred after all. While it burdens his principles, he chooses to create some ambiguity, but it seems to strike a chord with the Earl. He concurs, adding that if there's any way he can assist, he should make it known. Provided it's within the realm of possibility, he will guarantee its realization. Chris contemplates, stating, In that scenario, he hopes House Tyrion will relinquish the long-standing animosity towards House Khazar, rather than their current adversarial stance, where they perpetually bare their teeth at one another. He desires a cordial, yet rivalrous connection, where they can collaborate on appropriate progress, something befitting their shared lineage. The Earl starts to speak, but Chris interjects, asserting he's certain he understands. He's aware the root of their house's conflict stems from the machinations of the primary clan. From the main clan's viewpoint, a unified branch family might pose a danger. It's a tactic to maintain them as mere watchdogs of the house. The Earl inquires if he's plotting an uprising against the main clan. Chris denies harboring such intentions. The Earl is astonished by his foresight. Chris expresses gratitude for the compliment, inquiring if he'll grant his petition. The Earl sighs, remarking that it's been some time since he last contacted Count Khazar. But before concluding his statement, he addresses him by his given name. Chris grins, stating that indeed, by gradually uniting their strengths, they can forge a more formidable alliance during the era of devastation. The Earl then nudges Yahello, questioning his hesitation, explaining that his son had something to convey. Yahello instructs him to accept this. He appears flustered as he presents the ash tablet. He explains that upon entering the cavern, it was on the ground, and since he remained unconscious, he ensured its safekeeping. Chris exclaims, if that's the case, he's so indebted he wishes to bestow further gifts. He's capable of that as well. Yahello growls and the Earl chuckles, declaring he shall present him with a reward instead. It's a summoning gem capable of containing a rank 4 monstrous creature. Chris remarks on its rarity. The Earl adds that he'll also submit a recommendation for his participation in the Holy Shadow Rite, and he wishes him favorable outcomes. Chris expresses gratitude for both the present and the encouragement. The Earl then advises him to recuperate as he and Yahello depart. Chris smiles, beckoning someone from behind the drape. A crimson aura emerges and Simon speaks. As anticipated, his discovery wasn't accidental. To think he could perceive through concealment. Even the Earl couldn't. Chris explains he detected the odor of blood. Simon presents himself as the chief steward of the Shadow Magic clan. Chris wonders if that implies he's the Elder's enforcer. Chris then contemplates where he's encountered the name Simon previously, and declares him the overseer of the Bloodshade Mages. He elucidates that the Bloodshade Mages make no distinction between the magic empire and the realm of light. They are a deranged faction that delights in wanton massacre and mayhem. The commander was a monster who attained the rank of 8 stars, and during the climax of the Era of Destruction, he ascended to 9 stars, becoming the 10th Archfiend. He's lost count of how frequently they nearly perish due to that leader. Furthermore, Simon is the offspring of the Devil of Carnage. Simon confessed his astonishment at the young master's capabilities, exceeding all expectations. Not only that, but the notion of him vanquishing a demon was unfathomable. Chris asserted his confidence that Oscar handled it single-handedly, inquiring if Simon witnessed the Dead Sea's dividing radiance. Simon refuted the claim, feigning ignorance about the matter. Simon accused him of playing coy after venturing into the cavern. Even the Demon King's remains were utterly obliterated, leaving no vestige, indicating it wasn't a counter-summoning. For complete disintegration within the cave to occur, his prowess was remarkable, prompting Simon to demand an explanation. He expected comprehension, as everything would be relayed to the senior patriarch. Chris questioned the need to divulge his ace in the hole. Simon reiterated the report to the elder, and Chris countered that if he were the patriarch, he'd prefer a cunning predator concealing their talons, rather than an obedient bookworm answering every query. Simon expressed surprise at his intriguing personality, and Chris inquired about an apology. Simon questioned the reason, and Chris explained the difficulty in distinguishing between counter-summoning and obliteration, based solely on remnants, hence the Count's misinterpretation as a counter-summoning. However, Simon's opposing belief had a basis, a simple deduction. Simon was the summoner. A demonic summoning incident, nearly fatal to a clan member, would be scandalous news, potentially reaching the patriarch's ears. Simon offered to bear responsibility, but Chris proposed secrecy, emphasizing the significant debt owed. Simon, astonished, questioned if it was a bargain. Chris affirmed, suggesting that interpretation would be beneficial. Simon acknowledged the understanding and expressed gratitude for the leniency, conveying the pleasure of their encounter and anticipation for a reunion. He eagerly awaited Chris's arrival at the main clan. Chris elucidated Simon's crucial future role during the era of devastation. Thus, forging a bond was imperative to alter the course of events. Chris's luggage levitated. As Mary announced the completion of homecoming arrangements, he commended her, and Yahello peeked in, inquiring about his departure. Chris reminded him of proper address. Prompting Yahello's confusion, Chris explained yesterday's oversight before the count, but insisted on upholding their agreement. Yahello was obligated to use the term big bro. Yahello protested their 2-year age difference, and Chris inquired about his intentions. Yahello admitted to delivering a cautionary message. He spoke of familial ties, and feeling conflicted about such treatment towards kin, urging caution. He assumed Chris's awareness, but young Master Loin vehemently opposed Chris's participation in the sacred dark rite. He emphasized the disparity between even 2 stars. Amongst main and branch families, the superior elixirs, the main family's ultimate techniques and dark magic blessings provided direct descendants a significant head start. Chris would be an easy target. He would be vulnerable. Chris smirked, offering a counter-warning, calling him little bro. He advised against participating in the sacred dark rite. For his own benefit, Yahello claimed concern, refusing to let Chris monopolize the pure dark energy. Chris instructed him to remember, regardless of opponents, they would rue confronting him in the sacred dark rite. Yahello's anger flared, and Chris signaled Mary to depart. He urged Yahello to reconsider and avoid future regrets. Later, he returned to Count Khazar's residence. Therm sought his brother, but learned of his immediate departure to the training grounds. Upon arrival, the butler conveyed his wish for solitary training until the sacred dark rite. Right. Therm finally located him using his full title. Honorable King Emperor Majesty Brother. Therm invoked their promised duel upon Chris's return. Chris marveled at his rapid growth, achieving middle 2-star status. His progress was astonishing. Citing training demands, he excused himself. Chris deduced his participation in the sacred dark rite, deeming it unacceptable. He postponed the duel, suggesting it after his training concluded, and that he should engage in training as well. Taj desires his pledge to avoid further postponement and ensure it's dissimilar from the previous occurrence. Chris assents and departs, advised to remain vigilant. Chris mutters about the boy's obstinate nature. A young lady inquires if a promise was secured. Chris remarks on the boy's striking resemblance to her, particularly within the practice grounds. Chris contemplates the dark tablet while seated on his bed. He calculates having a fortnight until the ceremony. He begins to consume the pill. He expresses his distaste for the pill's flavor. Reclining, he dedicates himself to absorbing the pill's essence. It courses through his internal channels. He notes the unexpected turbulence. A peculiar feeling washes over him. He questions the sensation's origin. He inquires if it's the luminescent energy he detects within. He ponders if the creature's final joyous sensation infused the pill. He speculates on its inclusion. He understands the difficulty fiends face in absorbing them. He dismisses its significance to himself. He continues channeling the energy throughout his system. Only the radiant energy remains. Fiends would typically expel this energy. Their instructors would aid in this process. He questions squandering such a valuable resource. He intends to direct it into his luminous core. He aims to absorb both energies concurrently. Light and darkness surge through his pathways. Each flows towards his respective core. He assimilates the pill's entirety. Chris's eyes emit a brilliant light upon opening. Closing them reveals an encroaching darkness. Later, a woman grants someone entry. He presents a report on her requested inquiry. He recounts the Demon King's summoning during the Dark Tablet Hunt. Despite the survival, he apologizes for the investigation's delay. The incident necessitated further scrutiny. She commends his efforts, and he replies that unless she has further inquiries, he offers to depart unless further inquiries remain. She examines a picture of Chris as he prepares to leave. Her name is revealed to be Adeline. Another half-month passes. Thurn announces the arrival of the appointed day. He states that the promised day has come. Chris grants him entry. He expresses surprise. Chris remarks on his early arrival. He implies Thurm's eagerness for a beating. Thurm questions the situation. He senses Chris's augmented presence. He warns Chris against provoking laughter. Chris offers to fulfill his desire for a thrashing. He proposes a wager. Victory carries a condition. Thurm must forfeit participation in the sacred dark rite. Thurm questions his intent. Chris clarifies. He emphasizes the competitive nature of the rite, discouraging the weak. Thurm commands silence and readies his weapon. Chris accuses him of blindness. He displays fraternal concern. He feels compelled to enforce understanding. He launches himself with a scream. The scene shifts to Thurm in the infirmary. He was effortlessly defeated. Their father deems Chris excessive. The healer prescribes half a month of confinement. Thurm must await the subsequent rite. Therm protests. Chris requests a private conversation. Their father consents to a brotherly discussion. Chris approaches Therm's bedside after their father's departure. He questions Therm's sullen demeanor. He discourages childish complaints. He reminds Therm that he initiated the confrontation. Therm accuses Chris of hindering his progress. He believes Chris belittles his accomplishments. He claims Chris intentionally injured him, preventing his participation in the sacred rite. Chris teases him about crying. He perceives a misunderstanding. His actions aim to strengthen Therm. Competing in the rite would hinder Therm's potential. Pure dark energy would become unattainable. His harshness stemmed from Therm's stubbornness. He seeks Therm's comprehension. Pure dark energy is deemed unsuitable for Therm. Therm questions his meaning. Gray dark energy is deemed more appropriate. An explanation follows. Light energy possesses various forms. Dark energy exhibits similar diversity. Pure dark energy reigns supreme among dark energies. Gray dark energy ranks beneath it, suitable for curse magic. He asserts, curse magic surpasses swordsmanship in Therm's aptitude. Therm inquires about Chris's knowledge source. Chris playfully evades revealing his foresight, and that he should formulate a plausible justification. Claiming he can discern that much while sparring with him, Chris informs him that if he absorbs pure dark energy prior to mastering gray dark energy, it could generate complications when he attempts to learn it later. Naturally, it won't be insurmountable since pure dark energy is the superior attribute, but he'll be hindered by its distinct characteristics, and it will merely decelerate his progress. He desires to attain maximum strength as rapidly as possible, and he encourages him to contemplate these matters before partaking in the ritual. This is his genuine counsel, offered as an elder sibling supporting his younger brother's development. Fern appears deeply moved, and then Chris presents him with a token. Thorn observes it and identifies it as an ash tablet. Inquiring why he's bestowing upon him such a precious object, Chris states that it's because he's his younger sibling, questioning what other rationale he requires. He already consumed something superior, in any case. He even becomes tearful. This scene is incredibly heartwarming. He remarks that if he were capable of such transformation, he ponders why he behaved so erratically. Even during their mother's final moments, he questions if he comprehends the extent of their mother's anguish due to him. Chris gazes at him and takes a seat beside him, admitting that he lacked understanding back then. The scene transitions to later as the carriages halt. Chris emerges, stating he requires a good stretch, inquiring about the distance traveled as his entire body aches. He questions if opening the warp gate would be too troublesome, and expresses disbelief at their pettiness. This will alter once he assumes leadership of the clan. Mary suddenly arrives, exclaiming her disbelief that they're embarking on a rendezvous. With just the two of them, she adds that it's sending her heart aflutter. Chris retorts that she doesn't possess a heart, and clarifies that, due to the main family's restriction of one companion, he can only be accompanied by Mary, since she's bound to him by their agreement. He notices others discussing him, and Mary remarks on his newfound fame. Simon addresses him as the young master, to everyone else's astonishment. They recognize him and inquire about the head butler's purpose in acknowledging the ne'er-do-well. Simon notes that in a mere fortnight, he's achieved significant growth. Chris inquires if the elder clan head's aide has no more pressing engagements. Simon dismisses this as absurd, clarifying that he's present under specific orders, and that the elder clan head desires a personal audience. Simon observes Chris's lack of surprise, asking if he anticipated this. Chris claims that he was, in fact, surprised. But Simon contradicts his assertion. The scene shifts to the clan head's chambers. Simon announces his arrival with Chris. The Duke acknowledges them and greets Chris after a period of absence, as Maran is seen in his company. Chris senses a potent gaze, remarking on its overwhelming presence. He can barely remain standing under the sheer pressure, and finds it audacious for him to emanate such dark energy. Despite knowing someone of his level can't endure it, his hands tremble and he bows his head, paying his respects to the Duke. The Duke inquires if he wasn't taken aback by the unexpected meeting. Chris replies that he anticipated his summons. The Duke asks for an explanation. Chris explains that a new prodigy has emerged within the clan. The Duke chuckles in agreement, mentioning that neither Marin nor Simon could contain their praise. Yet he remains uncertain about harboring expectations. Chris remains silent as the Duke elaborates, stating that regardless of potential, only time will reveal future growth. He could be a seedling that perishes upon sprouting. Chris concurs, admitting his current inadequacies. He is still too deficient to fulfill expectations. The Duke questions if he's implying future failure. Chris responds that only time will determine if a sapling will exceed expectations and mature into a magnificent tree. Perhaps it will even develop into an anomaly that overshadows a mighty tree. He assures the Duke he won't be a disappointment. The Duke laughs again and declares he will hold high hopes for him, dismissing him. After Chris departs, Maren seeks his opinion. He confesses that Chris surpassed his expectations. However, due to his exceptional talent, his destiny will be fraught with turmoil. She understands this as well, that the Crimson Gales heading towards the Magic Kingdom will shortly arrive at their doorstep. But that's not dreadful tidings, because a glimmer of hope has unexpectedly blossomed today. Maren appears astonished by this revelation, and the Duke states that he might genuinely be capable of realizing his long-held aspiration. It is now the eve of the hallowed shadow ceremony, and they commence proclaiming the entrance of Count Khazar's firstborn son, who is none other than Chris, dressed to the nines. People inquire why the Duke desired a meeting with a simpleton like him, and they remark that he resembles a jester. Chris declares that he anticipated this and that he is excessively handsome, and it's all due to his devastatingly good looks. Mary, naturally, is the ultimate cheerleader, affirming his statement. He then notices some beverages and inquires if they are indeed alcoholic. As he approaches, the server informs him that he's prohibited from consuming them due to being underage, and offers ginger ale as a substitute. In lieu of spirits, they even resort to mocking him. Chris finds their lack of sophistication astonishing and declines the ginger ale. He desires intoxicating libations. They then proceed to herald the arrival of the noble sons and daughters. As the doors gradually swing open, revealing them entering the chamber, we are officially introduced to Sid, the second noble son, along with the already acquainted Julianne, the first noble daughter, previously referenced, and now those yet unfamiliar, including Jen, the second noble daughter, and Misak, the third noble son. As they begin their procession, only 4 are present instead of the expected 5. Chris observes the absence of the first noble son. He ponders Acid's potential reaction, considering he was the casualty of his scheme, the event that cemented his notoriety. Acid passes by completely, remaining silent much to Chris's astonishment. Chris is irritated by Acid's refusal to meet his gaze. Despite his past actions, he concludes that Acid is no superior. Julianne, however, lifts her skirt in a subtle acknowledgement, catching him off guard, but he identifies her as Julianne and recalls his aunt's cautionary words about her. Yet he detects nothing particularly amiss. Chris decides to postpone further investigation, deeming this reconnaissance sufficient for the day, and declares it's time to return and prepare for the ceremony. A steward materializes behind him, announcing himself as Fowler, a conjurer in the service of young Master Loin. Chris questions the relevance. Fowler explains his concern about an unworthy individual participating in tomorrow's hallowed shadow ceremony, fearing an unqualified participant might cause a mishap, tarnishing the reputation of the Grand Shadow clan. Chris inquires if he's implying that he is the unworthy individual. Fowler suggests Chris must demonstrate his worthiness. Chris glances towards the upper levels, observing Lloyd's scornful gaze. Chris challenges Lloyd to confront him directly if he harbors any animosity, proposing a personal confrontation during the ceremony. He accepts the challenge, deeming it a trivial matter, and expresses a desire to witness Fowler's abilities. Fowler declines, citing his lack of weaponry. Chris questions if Fowler expects him to utilize a weapon against a weakling like himself. Fowler warns Chris of future regret. Chris counters, questioning Fowler's certainty, predicting Fowler will be the one to experience remorse. Jen and Julianne observe Chris intently, especially Julianne. The guests appear startled by an unexpected event. The cause of their surprise becomes apparent as Fowler is overwhelmed by a multitude of specters, while Chris is pampered with grapes and treated like a monarch. The guests are baffled by the spectacle. Fowler's summoned malevolent entities immediately rebelled against their conjurer. With a single motion, they marvel at Chris's swift acquisition of control. Chris questions if those were young Master Loin's intentions, deeming it unbecoming of a direct descendant of the Shadow Magic clan. He suggests a formal duel would have been more appropriate. Loin denies any involvement in the incident. Chris dismisses the denial as preposterous, but grants Loin the benefit of the doubt, proposing a future encounter during the hallowed shadow ceremony. He openly criticizes Loin's cowardice, vowing to instill proper etiquette in him next time. The day of the dark rite has arrived. Chris enters, stifling a yawn. Yahello inquires if he's even slightly apprehensive. Given the commotion he incited the previous day, Chris questions Alo's presence, despite explicitly cautioning him against coming, addressing him affectionately as little brother. Alo retorts, asking how Chris could disregard the hallowed dark rite, labeling him as Crazy Lloyd. Meanwhile, Lloyd descends the staircase, casting disdainful glances, as if asserting his superiority. Chris curtly tells him to be patient. An elderly voice resonates, inquiring if everyone has congregated. The speaker identifies himself as Sebastian, the deputy butler overseeing the main residence. He announces that he will now escort them to the consecrated area, where the dark rite will commence. He strikes the floor with his staff, unleashing peculiar, vibrant hues. The spectacle resembles a disturbing hallucinogenic experience. The others perceive stares materializing beneath them, evoking expressions of astonishment. Chris clarifies that the phenomenon is not what it seems, suggesting it might be an illusionary art manifesting a fabricated space. Sebastian begins descending the stairs, moving with remarkable swiftness. The others, gripped by panic, exclaim that he's abandoning them, fearing they'll be left behind. They hasten their pace, staying close behind him. They meticulously follow every twist and turn. Some participants express bewilderment, remarking on the unexpected steep incline. Despite believing they were descending underground, even Loan and Alo exhibit signs of exertion. Sebastian urges everyone to expedite their descent, warning that the ground's stability is ephemeral. Some individuals begin plummeting into the abyss. Anxiety washes over the remaining participants. Sebastian declares that due to their tardiness, he will now accelerate his pace. He moves with unprecedented speed. More casualties succumb to the void. Loin asserts that the weak should acknowledge their inferiority, declaring them unworthy of being present. Perspiration beads on his brow. He then observes Chris effortlessly surpassing him, marveling at his composure and lack of fatigue. Chris inquires if Loin is already winded, mockingly suggesting he's all talk and no action. He remarks that as a direct descendant, Loan should demonstrate greater prowess. He cynically speculates that Loin must have been excessively pampered with potent potions. Chris retorts that their foolishness has only inflicted needless physical strain. He emphasizes the futility of exerting oneself in an illusory realm. Regardless of physical exertion, his stamina remains undiminished. With a simple incantation, he can achieve invincibility within this domain. Sebastian beams with approval, deducing that he must be the esteemed young Master Christian. They finally reach their destination, everyone gasping for air. A breathless Alo questions Chris's unblemished state. Chris remarks that this demonstrates the importance of physical training, rather than relying on creature-borne transportation. A new voice extends a welcome. As a crystal materializes before them, it levitates around the chamber. The voice explains that this is the hallowed ground, a place of immense sanctity. Here, the purest form of dark energy emanates, earning it the designation Sacred Darkness. The speaker introduces herself as Rahu, the custodian of the sacred ground. She greets the assembled young masters and mistresses. She elucidates, explaining that their objective is to acquire the formidable pure darkness, akin to the third-ranked demon king. The Dark Destroyer, forefather of the dark magic clan. A cerulean luminescence emerges on the ground, coursing beneath each participant. Rahu reveals that there's an insufficient quantity for everyone. Resident demonic beasts will assess their merit. Chris surmises that success hinges on being the first to arrive. Rahu commends his astuteness. Chris inquires about the consequences of unforeseen mishaps, specifically if competitor conflict during the rite would result in disqualification. She explains that individualized paths minimize encounter possibilities. However, should conflict arise, avoidance is recommended, as wasted time benefits rivals. She initiates a countdown. She instructs them to maintain focus and prioritize personal safety. She offers a parting wish of good fortune. As the countdown concludes, the competitors disperse onto their designated routes. They embark upon their respective journeys. Sebastian and Rahu remain, observing. Sebastian proposes, wagering a measure of blood juice on the victor. Naturally, she disappears, leaving him in disbelief at being dismissed so casually. We return to Loan, progressing further along the passage. He detects a horde of creatures up ahead. They commence channeling magical energy and lunge at him, flames erupting from their jaws. He infuses his hand with an aura, striking outward, landing a blow on one's throat, then swiftly moving from beast to beast, eliminating them instantly. He remarks that they are, at most, low-ranking, Tier 2 magical entities posing no threat to him, a high-level 2-star mage. However, he suspects Chris is facing considerable difficulty. According to the established guidelines, each route should present equal distance and challenges, yet he suborned a sorcerer, ensuring only Chris's path would harbor more formidable demonic beasts. He anticipates encountering stronger demonic beasts himself, but through sheer happenstance, Chris will meet a dreadful end. Since fatalities during the rite are disregarded, it will become Chris's tomb. After some time, he finally reaches a portal. Luan declares this must be the entrance to the hallowed grounds, and he expected to arrive first. Chris inquires about the delay, complaining about the tedious wait. Loin questions Chris's rapid arrival. Chris claims it was uneventful. Loin expresses disbelief, since Chris's path should have presented stronger adversaries. He abruptly stops, realizing his blunder. Chris smirks, stating, "It's no wonder the creatures seemed stronger than anticipated." So it was Loin's doing. Loin demands to know how Chris can make such accusations. Chris points out they'll be alone for a while, questioning the need for pretense. Loin insults Chris, calling him arrogant, reminding him that conflict between competitors during the rite is forbidden. Regardless, he intends to defeat Chris immediately. He launches an attack, but Chris effortlessly evades it. Chris observes that Loin is employing magic combat arts, a fighting style that unleashes magic power at close proximity, or incapacitates opponents by dislocating their joints. Chris consistently dodges every single attack, frustrating Loin. Loin even resorts to calling Chris a slippery rodent. Loin then perceives an opening in Chris's hand and charges forward, intending to exploit it. He vows to break Chris. Chris calls him foolish, seizing his wrist instead, and applying an arm lock. He tells Loin not to cry out in pain, and then a snapping sound echoes. Loin unleashes a piercing scream. Yahello rushes down the corridor, wondering if he's too late. He finds Loin and another contestant incapacitated on the ground. Yahello asks if Chris is responsible. Chris calls him incredibly slow, asking if Yahello will surrender willingly, or if Chris must force him. Yahello claims he hasn't been idle. He attacks, but is swiftly defeated. Chris remarks on the sense of déjà vu. He believes they'll be discovered if left there. He explains that in 5 years, the first major conflict against the Alliance will commence. He must control the Dark Magic clan before then. Therefore, he cannot share even a fraction of the darkness. Having finished eliminating the competition, it's time to claim the sacred darkness. The sacred darkness empowers a fiend to potentially achieve true transcendence. The Duke, having absorbed 80% of it, is among the most powerful beings, even among the demon monarchs. The Dark Destroyer also assimilated over 90% of the pure dark energy to become a demon king. By acquiring 100% of the dark energy, Chris could surpass even the demon emperor. Standing before it, he extends his hand, and the darkness surges into him. Elsewhere, onlookers express astonishment. Everyone except Chris was eliminated. Panic ensues as young Master Lo's condition is grave. They speculate Chris used trickery or a forbidden magical artifact. They demand a thorough investigation and punishment. John declares it unnecessary, as Chris won't reach the hallowed ground anyway. His 2-day absence implies that, unless it truly takes that long to absorb the sacred darkness, due to its immense power, Chris has been overwhelmed and perished. Even the Duke had a limit to his absorption capacity. Chris is undoubtedly deceased. Not even a body will remain. As she departs, she shuts the door, her expression filled with fury, uttering that even if he returns alive, she will eliminate him herself. Because when her father perished during his combat against the Coalition, only she and Lone were taken in by their uncle, Viscount Langham. Therefore, her position within the family is already precarious. And since Lone was unable to acquire the sacred darkness either, no one will endorse him as the heir, and that she will avenge Chris for this humiliation. Even some of them comment stating that the useless individual still hasn't emerged and must already be deceased, and it's retribution for being avaricious without understanding his station. They remark that even the specter over there is awaiting its master, but she will soon encounter her master's phantom. It appears Mary punctures one of the sacks, essentially issuing them a caution, and she declares that her heart races as she anticipates her young master. But if they persist in being boisterous around her, she will transform them into spirits under her dominion. They flee, apologizing profusely. And she reverts back to being adorable, imploring Chris to return swiftly, as a gentleman who keeps a lady waiting is utterly uncool. It then transitions to Chris perspiring profusely, exclaiming that this is an interminable obscurity that suffocates him, and that he's only around the 70% threshold, and that this is far more challenging than he anticipated. But he must persevere regardless. The true trial will commence around the 90% mark, and if he absorbs too much and surpasses his limitations, his core will fracture and he will perish here before the conflict even begins. He then comprehends something, stating, "That's correct. If only I possessed a dragon's heart." The dragon possesses the most substantial receptacle for its core, so even if it's just for a brief period, he can emulate its heart. There might be a solution there. As he strives to do so, even greater energy is being assimilated, and it gradually begins to disintegrate. He declares this is his boundary and must cease, and we hear Meth Han inquiring if he requires assistance. He then observes her materialize before him in this dimension, and she's a statuesque woman, but he's utterly astonished. He inquires how a demon is present in this realm, and she responds, "The power of demons is to commune within darkness, and this presents no obstacle to me. It is feasible for me to aid you in this situation." Without any stipulations, he asks why, and she chuckles, stating it's merely a passing fancy, and to grasp her hand, as it will enable him to absorb all of the sacred darkness. It then leaps to 1 week later as the Duke sets down his cup. He remarks that it would be difficult to assert that Chris is still living, when there has been no communication whatsoever. Marin seems perplexed, inquiring why he would be so covetous to this extent. And Simon states that Viscount Langham concurs with him and desires to seal the passage leading to the hallowed ground soon. The Duke contemplates this and asks Simon if he will issue the order. The Duke clarifies that he is merely attempting to evaluate this elderly gentleman, and inquires of Simon if he believes that impetuous youth is still alive. Simon responds that the likelihood is negligible, but that he is quite intriguing, so he genuinely doesn't know. The Duke ponders for a moment longer,